Chapter 1: Blood and Noble Birthright. The forensic team that entered the ruins of Castle Čachtice in the autumn of 2018 expected to find evidence of medieval construction techniques and perhaps some artifacts from Hungary's turbulent past. What they discovered instead would send shockwaves through the international archaeological community and reignite debates about one of history's most notorious figures. Behind walls that had stood for over 400 years, they found human remains that told a story of systematic torture and murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Dozens of skeletons, many bearing evidence of extreme trauma, had been carefully concealed within the castle's structure. But most disturbing of all was the evidence of deliberate preservation techniques that suggested someone had been conducting experiments on human bodies with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher. The inscription carved into one of the concealed chambers read simply, "Beauty eternal through noble blood." The date carved below it was 1604. To understand how such horrors came to be perpetrated within the walls of one of Hungary's greatest castles, we must journey back to an age when noble birth was considered divine mandate, when the distance between aristocrat and peasant was measured not just in wealth, but in the fundamental nature of human worth itself. We must return to 1590, when the most powerful woman in the Kingdom of Hungary was about to discover that absolute power over human life could serve purposes that went far beyond mere political dominance or economic exploitation. Elizabeth Báthory was born into a world where her family name carried more weight than the lives of entire villages, where the blood that flowed through her veins was considered inherently superior to that of the thousands of souls who laboured to support her magnificent existence. The Báthory lineage stretched back through centuries of Hungarian history, producing kings, princes, warriors and statesmen whose deeds had shaped the destiny of nations. Her family controlled vast territories across Hungary and Transylvania, commanding resources that rivaled those of kings, and wielding authority that was answerable to no earthly power, save the will of God and the distant Habsburg emperor who nominally ruled their lands. But what made Elizabeth's position truly extraordinary was not just inherited wealth and political influence, but the particular combination of circumstances that had transformed her from merely powerful noblewoman into something approaching an absolute monarch within her own domains. The death of her husband, Ferenc Nádasdy, in 1604 had left her in control of estates that encompassed dozens of castles, hundreds of villages, and tens of thousands of subjects whose lives were entirely at her disposal, according to the feudal laws that governed relationships between nobles and peasants in the Kingdom of Hungary. Ferenc had been known throughout Europe as the Black Knight of Hungary, a military commander whose campaigns against the Ottoman Empire had earned him legendary status among the Habsburg nobility and fear among the Turkish forces that had learned to retreat when his banners appeared on battlefields. But his death from illness rather than glorious combat had left Elizabeth as regent for estates that required constant management, and as guardian of children whose minority ensured that she would exercise unchallenged authority over some of the most valuable territories in the Habsburg domains for years to come. The legal framework that governed noble privilege in late 16th century Hungary was designed to ensure that aristocratic families could maintain their power across generations without interference from royal authority or popular resistance. Lords and ladies of Elizabeth's rank possessed what legal scholars termed high justice over their subjects, the right to inflict any punishment up to and including death without appeal to higher courts or external oversight. This authority was not merely theoretical. It was exercised daily through systems of corporal punishment, judicial torture, and execution that maintained social order through systematic intimidation of peasant populations who might otherwise challenge aristocratic control. But Elizabeth's exercise of this traditional authority began to take forms that exceeded even the brutal norms of feudal justice, revealing appetites and interests that transformed legal privilege into something far more sinister and personal. The stories that began to circulate among the villages surrounding her various castles spoke not of harsh, but predictable punishment for specific crimes, but of arbitrary violence inflicted for reasons that seemed to have nothing to do with maintaining social order or enforcing legal compliance. Servants who entered Elizabeth's service would disappear without explanation, their families receiving no word of their fate despite careful inquiries made through the networks of gossip and information that connected peasant communities across her territories. The young women who were recruited to work in her castles with promises of good wages and valuable training in domestic arts, would vanish so completely that their very existence began to be questioned by neighbours who wondered whether they had ever truly lived at all. More disturbing were the reports from those few servants who managed to escape Elizabeth's employment and flee to territories controlled by other noble families. These refugees spoke of witnessing punishments that went far beyond anything justified by the crime supposedly committed, of tortures that seemed designed more to satisfy the perpetrator's curiosity about human suffering than to maintain discipline among the household staff. They described systematic cruelty that appeared to follow no logic except the exploration of how much pain a human body could endure before death provided release from agony. But what made these reports particularly troubling was not just their content, but their consistency across multiple witnesses who had fled from different castles during different time periods. The stories they told suggested not random outbursts of aristocratic violence, but carefully planned activities that were conducted with the methodical precision of someone pursuing systematic investigation into questions that required extensive experimentation to resolve. The transformation that had occurred in Elizabeth's behaviour following her husband's death reflected more than just the psychological stress of widowhood, or the practical challenges of managing vast estates without masculine support. Ferenc's presence had provided both emotional stability and practical constraint that had channeled her energies into conventional aristocratic pursuits, managing household affairs, supervising agricultural production, maintaining social relationships with other noble families, and supporting her husband's military and political activities. But Ferenc's death had eliminated both the companionship that had satisfied her emotional needs and the external oversight that had limited her exercise of absolute authority over the thousands of people whose lives were entirely subject to her will. The isolation that came with her exalted social position was intensified by widowhood that cut her off from the forms of partnership and collaboration that had previously provided structure and meaning for her daily existence. This isolation was compounded by the particular nature of aristocratic life in the remote castles that dotted the Hungarian countryside, far from the cosmopolitan influences of Vienna or Prague, where contact with other members of the high nobility might have provided both entertainment and informal supervision of behaviour that violated accepted norms even within the permissive context of noble privilege. Elizabeth's primary residences were located in territories where her authority was unchallenged and unobserved, where the only people who could witness her actions were servants and subjects who possessed neither the legal standing nor the physical means to resist or report activities that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention from royal officials or ecclesiastical authorities. But perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's position as one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe provided her with resources that could support activities requiring substantial investment of time, money, and human material without creating financial or logistical constraints that might have limited the scope of whatever projects she chose to pursue. Her income from agricultural production, mining operations, and feudal obligations provided virtually unlimited funding for any experiments or investigations that captured her interest, while her legal authority over thousands of subjects ensured access to human subjects for whatever purposes she might devise. The combination of absolute power, unlimited resources, and complete isolation from external constraint created circumstances that were uniquely suited to the development of appetites and activities that would have been impossible for anyone of lesser status or more limited means. Elizabeth possessed everything necessary to explore questions about human nature and capability that would have remained purely theoretical for people whose circumstances required them to consider practical consequences or moral implications of pursuing answers through direct experimentation. The stories that began to emerge from her territories in the years following Ferenc's death suggested that she had begun to use these extraordinary advantages to investigate possibilities that had previously been constrained by conventional assumptions about appropriate behaviour for people of her rank and gender. The systematic disappearance of servants, the reports of elaborate torture sessions, and the evidence of careful preservation and concealment of human remains all pointed toward activities that served purposes beyond mere sadistic pleasure or arbitrary exercise of aristocratic privilege. Instead, they suggested the emergence of someone who had recognized that her unique circumstances provided opportunities to explore questions about beauty, mortality, and human suffering that could not be investigated through conventional means, that required extensive experimentation with living subjects to produce reliable results. The transformation from conventional aristocrat into something approaching a natural philosopher of human pain appeared to have begun with the recognition that her position provided perfect laboratory conditions for investigations that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. The legal and social structures that had been designed to protect aristocratic privilege from external interference had created a space where human curiosity could operate without moral or practical constraint, where questions about the nature of life and death could be explored through methods that treated human subjects as experimental material rather than beings possessed of inherent dignity or rights. The same feudal authority that was intended to maintain social order had become the foundation for activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between legitimate governance and criminal violence. As the seasons turned and Elizabeth settled into her new role as sole authority over vast territories and thousands of subjects, the reports from her domains began to suggest that she was developing interests and capabilities that would eventually make her name synonymous with systematic cruelty conducted on an unprecedented scale. But these early signs of transformation were subtle enough to be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding by those few outside observers who heard rumours of unusual activities within her well-guarded castles. The woman who had been raised to believe that her noble blood granted her natural superiority over common humanity was beginning to explore the practical implications of that superiority in ways that would eventually produce evidence of systematic murder conducted with scientific precision. The accidents of birth and circumstance that had provided her with unlimited authority over human life were about to be employed in service of investigations that would transform feudal privilege into something resembling a laboratory for the study of human suffering and mortality. The forensic evidence that would be discovered 4 centuries later in the walls of Castle Čachtice was already beginning to accumulate as Elizabeth embarked on the systematic exploration of possibilities that her unique position made available. The bones that would horrify modern investigators were being created through experiments designed to answer questions about beauty, preservation, and the relationship between noble blood and common humanity that could only be resolved through extensive practical investigation, using methods that treated human subjects as raw materials for research, rather than persons deserving of moral consideration. The transformation from conventional aristocrat into history's most notorious female serial killer was beginning in the isolation of Hungarian castles, where absolute power was about to encounter unlimited curiosity about the possibilities that such power created for someone willing to explore them without regard for conventional moral or legal constraints. The blood that would eventually fill the baths that made Elizabeth's name legendary was already beginning to flow as she discovered that her noble birthright provided opportunities that extended far beyond traditional aristocratic privileges into territory that would make her simultaneously famous and infamous throughout European history. Chapter 2. The Widow's Inheritance. The morning when Ferenc Nádasdy drew his last breath in the great chamber of Sava Castle brought with it not just the end of a legendary military career, but the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the very nature of power in the Báthory domains. Ferenc had been more than Elizabeth's husband. He had been the external force that channeled her considerable intelligence and ambition into conventionally acceptable aristocratic pursuits. His presence had provided structure for her days, purpose for her energies, and most importantly, witnesses to her behaviour, whose opinions carried sufficient social weight to impose informal constraints on activities that might damage the family's reputation or political standing. But Ferenc's death from fever in January 1604 eliminated these restraining influences, while simultaneously concentrating unprecedented authority in Elizabeth's hands. At 44 years old, she found herself in complete control of estates that encompassed more territory than many European principalities, commanding revenues that exceeded those available to most kings, and wielding legal authority over subjects whose numbers rivaled the populations of major cities. The legal documents that transferred Ferenc's holdings to her custody represented not just inheritance of property, but assumption of powers that approached those of sovereign rulers within the boundaries of her domains. The magnitude of Elizabeth's new authority can scarcely be comprehended by modern minds, accustomed to systems of government that distribute power among multiple institutions and subject even the highest officials to legal oversight and popular accountability. As feudal lord of dozens of castles and hundreds of villages, Elizabeth possessed what legal scholars termed high justice, the right to impose any punishment, including death, without appeal to external courts or oversight by royal officials. Her word was literally law for the tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, merchants, and lesser nobles who lived within her territories, and her decisions regarding their fates were final and unappealable according to the feudal customs that governed relationships between lords and subjects in the Kingdom of Hungary. But beyond mere legal authority, Elizabeth's position provided her with resources that made virtually any project or investigation financially feasible without external support or oversight. The agricultural production from her vast estates generated annual revenues measured in hundreds of thousands of florins, while mining operations in her Transylvanian territories provided access to precious metals and gemstones that could fund activities requiring substantial capital investment. Her wealth was not merely personal luxury, but institutional power that could support whatever enterprises captured her interest, regardless of their cost in money, materials, or human resources. The practical implications of this extraordinary concentration of wealth and authority became apparent within months of Ferenc's death. As Elizabeth began to exercise her newfound independence in ways that revealed appetites and interests that had been constrained during her marriage by the need to consider her husband's political reputation and military career, the reports that began to filter out of her territories spoke of changes in household management, judicial proceedings, and treatment of servants that suggested fundamental shifts in priorities and methods rather than mere adjustment to widowhood. The first signs of transformation appeared in Elizabeth's approach to recruiting and managing domestic staff for her various castles and manor houses. Where Ferenc had maintained relatively stable household establishments, with servants who often remained in family employment for years or even decades, Elizabeth began implementing rapid turnover policies that brought constant streams of new workers into her service, while ensuring that few remained long enough to develop detailed knowledge of household routines or personal relationships that might create uncomfortable familiarity between mistress and servants. This policy was justified through elaborate rhetoric about maintaining appropriate social distinctions and preventing the kind of casual intimacy between nobles and commoners that could undermine proper hierarchical relationships. But the practical effect was to ensure that Elizabeth's activities within her private chambers and personal apartments remained unknown to anyone who possessed the social connections or length of service that might make them credible witnesses if they chose to report unusual activities to external authorities or rival noble families seeking information that could be used for political advantage. The recruitment methods that Elizabeth employed to maintain this constant flow of new servants revealed sophisticated understanding of peasant psychology and economic vulnerability that allowed her to attract young women from throughout her territories without creating suspicions about their ultimate fate when they disappeared from family and community networks. Her agents offered positions that promised not just good wages and regular meals, but valuable training in domestic arts that could prepare ambitious peasant girls for more prestigious employment in noble households or advantageous marriages to artisans and merchants whose prosperity required wives with sophisticated household management skills. These promises proved irresistibly attractive to families struggling with the economic pressures that characterized peasant life in late medieval Hungary, where poor harvests or unexpected expenses could threaten survival, while opportunities for daughters to improve their social position remained severely limited. Parents who might have been suspicious of offers that seemed too generous readily accepted arrangements that appeared to provide genuine pathways for their daughters to escape the grinding poverty and limited prospects that defined peasant existence. But the young women who entered Elizabeth's service under these promising circumstances found themselves in situations that bore little resemblance to the domestic training and career advancement they had been promised. Instead of learning valuable household skills through gradual instruction and increasing responsibility, they were subjected to treatment that seemed designed more to explore their psychological and physical limits than to prepare them for future employment or marriage. The work assignments they received often involved tasks that served no apparent practical purpose beyond testing their willingness to endure discomfort, humiliation, or pain without complaint or resistance. They were required to maintain perfect stillness for extended periods while being subjected to physical examination that exceeded anything necessary for health assessment or work assignment. Most disturbing, they were forbidden to communicate with each other or maintain contact with their families, creating isolation that prevented them from sharing experiences that might reveal patterns or purposes behind treatment that individually appeared merely harsh, but collectively suggested systematic investigation of human responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. The transformation in Elizabeth's judicial procedures revealed even more clearly the shift from conventional aristocratic authority towards something approaching systematic experimentation with human subjects. The feudal court system that operated within her territories had traditionally focused on maintaining social order through predictable punishment of clearly defined crimes according to established legal customs that were understood by both nobles and peasants as necessary for preventing chaos and preserving hierarchical stability. But Elizabeth's approach to administering justice began to emphasize not deterrence or social control, but detailed exploration of how different forms of punishment affected their recipients in ways that seemed designed to gather information rather than maintain order. Minor infractions that had traditionally been resolved through fines, public humiliation, or brief imprisonment were now subjected to elaborate disciplinary procedures that involved extensive physical examination and experimentation with various techniques for inflicting pain while maintaining the subject's consciousness and ability to respond to questioning about their experiences. More significantly, Elizabeth began creating new categories of offence that criminalised behaviours that had never previously been considered violations of law or custom. Servants who displayed insufficient enthusiasm in their work, who failed to maintain perfect grooming standards, or who showed signs of homesickness or family loyalty found themselves subjected to punishment that treated these natural human responses as evidence of moral corruption requiring correction through methods that seemed designed more to satisfy curiosity about human psychology than to modify behaviour. The isolation that characterised Elizabeth's position within the social hierarchy of Hungarian nobility intensified dramatically following Ferenc's death, as she found herself cut off from the forms of companionship and collaboration that had previously provided structure for her daily life and outlets for her considerable intellectual energies. The other noble families whose estates bordered her territories maintained careful diplomatic relations, but avoided social intimacy that might create obligations or complications in the complex web of political alliances that characterized aristocratic life in the Habsburg domains. This social isolation was compounded by the geographic remoteness of Elizabeth's primary residences, located in mountainous regions of northern Hungary, where travel between castles required substantial time and effort, while contact with major urban centres like Vienna or Prague became increasingly infrequent. The magnificent isolation that had once provided privacy and security for family life now created circumstances where Elizabeth's activities could develop without external observation or informal constraint from social peers whose opinions might have moderated behaviour that exceeded acceptable norms even within the permissive context of aristocratic privilege. But perhaps most significantly, Ferenc's death had eliminated the emotional partnership that had provided psychological stability and personal satisfaction during the early decades of Elizabeth's adult life. Their marriage had been arranged for political and economic reasons according to the customs that governed noble families, but it had developed into genuine collaboration that satisfied both partners' needs for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional support within the constraints of aristocratic social expectations. Without this central relationship to provide meaning and structure for her personal life, Elizabeth found herself confronting the psychological challenges of middle age without the domestic satisfactions that sustained most women of her class through the transition from youth to maturity. The children she had borne were either dead or absent, pursuing their own careers and marriages, while the grandchildren who might have provided new sources of emotional engagement remained young enough to require care from nurses and tutors rather than direct attention from their grandmother. The combination of unlimited power, vast resources, complete isolation from external constraint, and profound personal emptiness created psychological conditions that were uniquely suited to the development of activities and interests that would have been impossible under different circumstances. Elizabeth possessed everything necessary to explore questions and possibilities that had remained theoretical during her marriage, when practical considerations and social obligations had prevented systematic investigation of subjects that required extensive experimentation with human materials to produce reliable results. The projects that she began to develop in the months following Ferenc's death reflected not random cruelty or arbitrary exercise of aristocratic privilege, but systematic investigation of questions about human nature, beauty, mortality, and the relationship between noble blood and common humanity that could only be explored through methods that treated living subjects as experimental materials rather than persons possessed of inherent dignity or rights. The transformation from conventional aristocrat into something approaching a natural philosopher of human suffering had begun with the recognition that her unique circumstances provided perfect laboratory conditions for investigations that would have been impossible under any other social, legal, or economic arrangements. The feudal authority that was intended to maintain social order was becoming the foundation for activities that would eventually challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between legitimate governance and systematic murder. As winter gave way to spring in 1604 and Elizabeth settled into her new role as absolute authority over vast territories and thousands of subjects, the early experiments that would eventually escalate into systematic killing had already begun in the private chambers of castles, where her word was law and her curiosity could operate without moral or practical constraint. The widow's inheritance included not just wealth and power, but opportunities that would prove far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined when the legal documents transferring Ferenc's estates were signed and sealed according to the customs that governed aristocratic succession in the Kingdom of Hungary. The blood that would eventually fill the baths that made Elizabeth's name legendary was already beginning to flow as she discovered that absolute power could serve purposes that extended far beyond traditional aristocratic privileges into territory that would transform her from feudal lord into history's most notorious practitioner of systematic cruelty conducted with scientific precision and unlimited resources. Chapter 3. The First Taste of Crimson. The discovery that would reshape Elizabeth's understanding of possibilities available to someone in her position occurred on a humid August afternoon in 1604, during what should have been a routine disciplinary session in her private chambers at Castle Čachtice. A young serving girl named Anna, barely 16 years old, had been brought before the Countess for the minor infraction of allowing dust to accumulate on a silver mirror in Elizabeth's dressing room, a transgression that under normal circumstances would have warranted nothing more severe than a sharp reprimand, and perhaps temporary reduction of meals as a reminder of the importance of maintaining perfect cleanliness in noble households. But Elizabeth's approach to household discipline had been evolving throughout the months since Ferenc's death, becoming increasingly elaborate and personal as she discovered that the absolute authority she wielded over her servants provided opportunities for exploration that went far beyond mere maintenance of domestic order. What had begun as conventional aristocratic punishment was gradually transforming into systematic investigation of human responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure, conducted with the methodical curiosity of someone pursuing knowledge that could only be obtained through direct experimentation with living subjects. The session with Anna began according to the patterns Elizabeth had been developing for dealing with servants whose performance failed to meet her increasingly exacting standards. The girl was ordered to kneel before her mistress, while detailed explanations were provided about the importance of maintaining perfect cleanliness in aristocratic households, the moral significance of attention to detail in all aspects of domestic service, and the necessity of punishment to ensure that lessons were learned thoroughly enough to prevent repetition of similar failures. But as the verbal instruction continued and Elizabeth observed the girl's responses to increasingly harsh criticism and psychological intimidation, she found herself becoming fascinated by the subtle changes in facial expression, breathing patterns, and physical posture that revealed the internal struggle between fear and defiance that characterized Anna's attempt to maintain dignity while acknowledging fault and accepting punishment. The girl's beauty, enhanced rather than diminished by the emotional vulnerability that Elizabeth's authority created, began to suggest possibilities that extended beyond conventional disciplinary objectives. The escalation from verbal correction to physical punishment occurred gradually, through a series of small steps that individually appeared justified by the need to ensure proper respect for authority, while collectively moving toward territory that exceeded anything warranted by the original infraction. Elizabeth ordered Anna to remove her outer clothing to facilitate examination for other signs of negligence in personal grooming and cleanliness, a demand that was humiliating but not unprecedented in noble households, where servants' bodies were considered property of their employers, subject to inspection and evaluation. but the examination that followed revealed Elizabeth's growing interest in the aesthetic and scientific possibilities presented by complete control over young female bodies that possessed the kind of natural beauty that aristocratic women spent fortunes attempting to preserve and enhance through cosmetics, clothing, and elaborate grooming rituals. Anna's youth and health created visual contrasts with Elizabeth's own aging flesh that seemed to suggest questions about the relationship between beauty and mortality that could only be explored through systematic comparison and experimentation. The moment of transformation occurred when Elizabeth's increasingly aggressive handling of the girl during the supposed cleanliness inspection resulted in scratches that drew blood from Anna's shoulder, creating crimson drops that fell onto Elizabeth's hand and arm. The physical contact with fresh blood from a young, healthy body produced an immediate and powerful psychological response that Elizabeth later described as recognition of possibilities she had never previously considered, despite her years of absolute authority over hundreds of servants whose lives were entirely subject to her will. The effect of the warm blood against her skin was not merely sensual, though the physical sensation was certainly pleasurable in ways that surprised her with their intensity. More significantly, the blood seemed to represent something that connected her directly to the life force that animated young, beautiful bodies, offering potential access to qualities that she felt slipping away with each year that moved her further from her own youth and closer to the physical decay that awaited all mortal flesh regardless of rank or wealth. But what made this moment truly transformative was Elizabeth's immediate recognition that her position provided unlimited opportunities to explore and develop whatever possibilities the blood might offer for preserving or enhancing her own beauty and vitality. Unlike other women of her age and class, who were forced to rely on conventional cosmetics and treatments that promised rejuvenation but delivered only temporary illusions, she possessed the authority and resources necessary to investigate whether direct application of young blood could produce genuine physiological benefits that would extend beyond superficial appearance to affect the fundamental processes of aging and decay. The systematic experimentation that began with Anna represented Elizabeth's transition from conventional aristocrat into something approaching a natural philosopher whose research focused on questions that could only be investigated through methods that treated human subjects as experimental materials rather than persons possessed of inherent dignity or rights. The girl's blood became the first component in investigations that would eventually require hundreds of subjects to produce reliable results about the relationship between noble blood and common blood, young blood and mature blood, living blood and dead blood. But the procedures that Elizabeth developed for collecting and applying blood revealed sophisticated understanding of both scientific method and human psychology that allowed her to conduct extensive research while maintaining the fiction that her activities were justified by conventional aristocratic privileges rather than representing systematic murder conducted for experimental purposes. The techniques she pioneered for extracting maximum quantities of blood while maintaining subject consciousness and responsiveness demonstrated careful study of human anatomy and physiology that exceeded anything available through conventional medical knowledge. The immediate effects that Elizabeth observed from applying Anna's blood to her own skin provided encouragement for continuing and expanding the research, despite the obvious practical complications involved in obtaining sufficient quantities of fresh blood to support systematic investigation. The visual improvement in skin texture and colour appeared almost instantaneous, while the psychological benefits of feeling directly connected to youthful vitality created sensations of power and renewal that were far more satisfying than anything she had experienced through conventional aristocratic pleasures. But more importantly, the experience revealed that her unique position provided perfect laboratory conditions for pursuing investigations that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. The legal authority that allowed her to inflict any punishment, including death, without external oversight, combined with the financial resources that could support whatever equipment and materials her research required, created opportunities for systematic exploration of questions about beauty, mortality, and human nature that could not be investigated through conventional means. The disposal of Anna's body established patterns that would be refined and perfected over the following years as Elizabeth's research expanded to require increasingly large numbers of subjects. The girl's disappearance was explained through carefully constructed stories about sudden illness, family emergencies, or transfer to other noble households that required immediate departure without opportunity for farewells or forwarding addresses. These explanations were accepted without question by Anna's family and community because they reflected common patterns of aristocratic employment where servants could be dismissed, transferred, or reassigned according to their employer's convenience without consideration for personal relationships or individual preferences. The success of these early deceptions revealed Elizabeth's sophisticated understanding of peasant psychology and social dynamics that would prove essential for maintaining the steady supply of subjects that systematic research would require. She recognized that disappearances could be concealed indefinitely as long as they appeared to follow normal patterns of aristocratic household management, rather than suggesting systematic elimination of servants for purposes that exceeded conventional employment relationships. But the concealment methods that Elizabeth developed for preserving evidence of her research demonstrated even more clearly her transition from conventional aristocrat into systematic investigator whose work required careful documentation and preservation of results for comparison and analysis. The techniques she pioneered for processing and storing human remains revealed extensive knowledge of anatomy and preservation methods that suggested consultation with medical authorities or independent study of texts that were normally available only to university-trained physicians and natural philosophers. The hidden chambers that were constructed within Castle Čachtice to accommodate Elizabeth's expanding research operations represented architectural innovations that combined practical necessity with aesthetic consideration for the visual and sensory environment in which her investigations would be conducted. These spaces were designed not merely as functional laboratories, but as environments that enhanced the psychological and physical experiences associated with blood collection and application procedures. The transformation that occurred into Elizabeth's daily routine following her discovery of blood's rejuvenating properties revealed the extent to which systematic research had begun to dominate her life and reshape her understanding of aristocratic privilege and responsibility. The conventional activities that had previously occupied her time, estate management, social correspondence, religious observances, became secondary to the pursuit of knowledge that could only be obtained through methods that required complete dedication and systematic application. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological changes that accompanied Elizabeth's transition into systematic research revealed fundamental shifts in her understanding of human nature and moral obligation that would prove essential for justifying and sustaining activities that exceeded anything previously documented in the history of aristocratic violence. The recognition that her position provided opportunities for investigation that could benefit not just herself, but potentially all of humanity, created intellectual frameworks that transformed systematic murder from criminal activity into scientific research that served purposes too important to be constrained by conventional moral or legal limitations. The blood that had begun to flow with Anna's death would continue flowing for years as Elizabeth developed increasingly sophisticated methods for collecting and applying the life essence of subjects whose youth and beauty made them particularly valuable for research that promised to unlock secrets of mortality and decay that had previously been considered beyond human knowledge. The first taste of crimson had revealed possibilities that would require hundreds of additional subjects to explore fully, transforming Castle Čachtice from aristocratic residence into laboratory, where the boundaries between scientific investigation and systematic murder would be erased through research that promised benefits too valuable to be limited by mere humanitarian concerns. The young serving girl whose blood had initiated Elizabeth's transformation into history's most notorious practitioner of systematic cruelty would be forgotten by everyone except the woman, whose life she had changed forever through the accidental revelation that noble privilege could serve purposes that extended far beyond conventional aristocratic pleasures, into territory that would make Elizabeth simultaneously famous and infamous throughout European history. Anna's death had been the beginning of investigations that would eventually require hundreds of additional subjects to complete. But it had also been the moment when a conventional aristocrat discovered that her unique circumstances provided opportunities that could reshape fundamental understanding of human nature and possibility. Chapter 4. Servants of Silence. The systematic expansion of Elizabeth's research into the rejuvenating properties of human blood required more than just additional subjects. It demanded the creation of a carefully selected inner circle of accomplices whose psychological profiles, personal circumstances, and emotional dependencies could ensure absolute loyalty while providing the specialized skills necessary for conducting increasingly complex procedures. The transformation from isolated experimentation into organised operation represented Elizabeth's recognition that sustainable research would require delegation of responsibilities to subordinates who possessed both the technical capabilities and the psychological resilience to participate in activities that exceeded conventional definitions of cruelty while maintaining perfect secrecy about methods and objectives that could never be revealed to external authorities. The first member of this inner circle was Dorothea Sentes, a woman whose background combined practical experience in folk medicine with personal circumstances that made her uniquely suitable for Elizabeth's purposes. Dorothea was approximately 50 years old when she entered the Countess's service in late 1604. A widow whose husband's death had left her without family connections or economic resources that could provide alternatives to whatever employment opportunities might be available to someone of her age and social position. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional healing practices had made her valuable to peasant communities throughout northern Hungary, but it had also created suspicions about possible involvement in witchcraft that made her vulnerable to accusations and persecution that could destroy her livelihood and endanger her life. But what made Dorothea particularly valuable to Elizabeth was not just her medical knowledge, but her sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology that had been developed through decades of treating injuries, illnesses, and childbirth complications under circumstances that required practical solutions rather than theoretical knowledge. Her experience with surgical procedures, pain management, and preservation of organic materials provided exactly the technical expertise that Elizabeth's research required as it evolved from simple blood application into more complex investigations that demanded precise control over subjects' physical responses and systematic documentation of experimental results. Dorothea's recruitment was accomplished through careful manipulation of her economic vulnerability and social isolation. Combined with gradual revelation of opportunities for intellectual and financial advancement that would be impossible to obtain through conventional employment, Elizabeth presented herself not as potential employer seeking domestic labour, but as patron interested in supporting serious investigation of medical questions that required collaboration between women, whose knowledge had been developed through practical experience rather than university training that excluded female participation. This approach appealed to Dorothea's genuine intellectual curiosity about medical questions while providing rational justification for activities that might otherwise have seemed morally problematic. The opportunity to pursue systematic investigation of healing arts while receiving generous compensation and protection from witchcraft accusations proved irresistibly attractive to someone whose alternatives included poverty, social ostracism, or potential execution if local authorities decided to investigate rumours about her involvement in supernatural practices. The second crucial recruitment was Katerina Benica, a younger woman whose personal history had created psychological vulnerabilities that Elizabeth recognised as ideal for ensuring loyalty through emotional manipulation rather than mere financial dependence. Katerina was approximately 30 years old, the daughter of a minor noble family whose political and economic decline had left her without the social connections or financial resources necessary to secure appropriate marriage within her class while preventing her from accepting employment that would compromise her aristocratic status. Katerina's situation reflected the broader social pressures that affected lesser nobility throughout the Habsburg domains, where economic changes and political instability had eliminated many traditional sources of income while maintaining social expectations that prevented adaptation to changing circumstances through conventional employment or marriage beneath one's inherited rank. A combination of aristocratic education with practical economic need created exactly the psychological profile Elizabeth required for someone who could serve as intermediary between the Countess herself and the peasant subjects who would provide raw materials for research. But what made Katerina particularly valuable was her desperate need for social acceptance and emotional security that could be satisfied through inclusion in activities that made her feel important and valued despite her precarious social position. Elizabeth's offer of permanent employment with substantial compensation, combined with treatment as trusted collaborator rather than mere servant, provided exactly the psychological rewards that Katerina required to maintain loyalty, even when the activities involved exceeded anything that conventional moral frameworks could justify. The third essential member of the inner circle was János Ficzko, whose recruitment represented Elizabeth's recognition that certain aspects of her research would require masculine strength and psychological resilience that female accomplices could not provide. Ficzko was a young man whose background included military service under Ferenc Nádasdy, where he had developed both physical capabilities and emotional detachment that made him suitable for tasks requiring violence against subjects who might attempt resistance or escape. Ficzko's military experience had familiarized him with systematic infliction of pain for interrogation purposes, while his service in campaigns against Ottoman forces had provided extensive exposure to methods of torture and execution that exceeded anything practiced within Christian territories. His knowledge of techniques for maintaining subject consciousness during extended physical trauma would prove essential as Elizabeth's research evolved to require more sophisticated procedures for extracting maximum quantities of blood while preserving subjects' responsiveness to experimental manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, Ficzko's psychological profile combined absolute loyalty to Elizabeth's family with complete indifference to the welfare of subjects who were not members of the aristocratic class he had been trained to serve. His military service had reinforced social hierarchies that placed enormous psychological distance between nobles and commoners, making it possible for him to participate in systematic violence against peasant subjects without experiencing moral conflict or emotional distress that might compromise operational security. The fourth and most mysterious member of Elizabeth's inner circle was the woman known only as Darvulia, whose background and true identity remained obscure despite her central role in developing the theoretical frameworks that transformed Elizabeth's activities from random cruelty into systematic investigation of questions about beauty, mortality, and human nature. Darvulia appeared to possess extensive knowledge of alchemical and medical traditions that had been preserved through networks of female practitioners whose expertise was passed down through generations without formal documentation or institutional recognition. Her understanding of human physiology, chemical processes, and preservation techniques exceeded anything available through conventional medical education, suggesting either extensive self-directed study of scholarly texts or access to knowledge traditions that were not normally available to people of her apparent social background. The procedures she developed for processing and applying human blood revealed sophisticated understanding of both biological and chemical principles that enabled Elizabeth's research to achieve results that would have been impossible through crude experimentation alone. But Darvulia's most significant contribution was philosophical rather than technical, providing intellectual frameworks that transformed systematic murder from criminal activity into legitimate scientific research that served purposes too important to be constrained by conventional moral limitations. Her arguments about the relationship between noble blood and common blood, the connection between physical beauty and spiritual purity, and the obligation of superior individuals to pursue knowledge regardless of cost to inferior subjects, created ideological justifications that allowed Elizabeth and her accomplices to maintain psychological equilibrium while participating in activities that would otherwise have created unbearable moral conflict. The recruitment and management of this inner circle required psychological sophistication that demonstrated Elizabeth's evolved understanding of human motivation and group dynamics as her research expanded from individual experimentation into organized operation, requiring coordination among multiple participants with different skills, backgrounds, and emotional needs. Each member was recruited through methods specifically designed to exploit their particular vulnerabilities, while providing rewards that could ensure continuing loyalty, despite the increasing severity of activities required by systematic investigation. But more importantly, Elizabeth developed techniques for managing group psychology that prevented the formation of emotional bonds between accomplices that might create alternative loyalties or shared moral perspectives that could challenge her absolute authority over research objectives and methods. Each member of the inner circle maintained separate relationships with Elizabeth, while being discouraged from developing personal friendships or professional partnerships that might create solidarity sufficient to resist directives that exceeded their individual comfort levels. The isolation and dependency that characterized each accomplice's relationship with Elizabeth ensured that resistance or betrayal would require individual moral courage that was unlikely to develop within social environments designed to reinforce hierarchical submission and emotional dependency. The combination of generous rewards, social elevation, and psychological manipulation created circumstances where continued participation became easier than rebellion, regardless of how extreme the activities became. The operational procedures that this inner circle developed for acquiring subjects, conducting experiments, and disposing of evidence represented innovations in systematic murder that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and practical logistics. The methods they pioneered for identifying suitable subjects, gaining access to victims, and maintaining secrecy about their fate required coordination among multiple participants whose different skills and social positions allowed them to operate throughout Elizabeth's territories without creating patterns that might attract unwanted attention from external observers. But perhaps most significantly, the development of this organised capability marked Elizabeth's transition from individual experimenter into institutional leader whose research had become systematic enterprise requiring permanent infrastructure and professional staff. The establishment of dedicated facilities within Castle Čachtice, the creation of specialised equipment for blood collection and processing, and the development of procedures for preserving and analysing experimental results demonstrated commitment to long-term investigation that would require years to complete and hundreds of subjects to provide reliable data. The servants of silence who enabled Elizabeth's transformation into history's most notorious practitioner of systematic cruelty had created operational capabilities that would support research activities for years while maintaining perfect secrecy about methods and objectives that could never be revealed to external authorities. Their loyalty, skills, and psychological resilience would prove essential for conducting investigations that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty while serving purposes that Elizabeth had convinced them were too important to be limited by conventional moral or legal constraints. The inner circle that assembled around Elizabeth during the months following her discovery of blood's rejuvenating properties represented more than just criminal conspiracy. It was the creation of an alternative moral universe where systematic murder could be justified as legitimate scientific research, serving purposes that transcended individual welfare in favour of knowledge that could benefit all humanity. The servants who had sworn themselves to silence about activities that exceeded conventional definitions of cruelty had become participants in enterprise that would eventually require hundreds of additional subjects to complete while establishing Elizabeth's reputation as practitioner of systematic violence conducted with scientific precision and unlimited resources. Chapter 5. The Chemistry of Cruelty. The evolution of Elizabeth's research from crude experimentation into systematic investigation required the development of methods that could maximize the extraction and preservation of blood while maintaining precise control over subjects' physiological responses throughout procedures that might continue for hours or even days. The crude techniques that had characterized her early experiments with servants like Anna were replaced by sophisticated procedures that demonstrated extensive study of human anatomy, careful observation of pain responses, and systematic documentation of results that allowed for comparison and refinement of methods based on empirical evidence rather than random cruelty. The transformation of Castle Čachtice's lower chambers into specialized laboratories represented architectural innovations that combined practical necessity with scientific methodology to create environments optimized for conducting research that required precise control over temperature, lighting, ventilation, and access to subjects who might remain conscious and responsive throughout extended experimental procedures. The chambers that Darvulia designed incorporated drainage systems for efficient blood collection, restraint mechanisms that prevented subject movement while allowing complete access to all areas of the body, and preservation facilities where collected materials could be processed and stored according to principles that ensured maximum potency and longevity. But the most significant advancement in Elizabeth's research methodology was the development of systematic approaches to pain management that allowed her to maintain subject consciousness and responsiveness throughout procedures that would normally result in shock, unconsciousness, or death from trauma. The techniques pioneered by Dorothea and refined through extensive experimentation revealed sophisticated understanding of human physiology that enabled researchers to inflict maximum suffering while preventing the physiological shutdown responses that would terminate experiments before maximum blood extraction could be achieved. The procedures that emerged from this systematic investigation represented innovations in torture that exceeded anything previously documented in European history, not merely in their cruelty, but in their scientific precision and methodical application of principles derived from careful study of human responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. The methods that Elizabeth's team developed for maintaining subject consciousness during blood loss preventing shock during tissue damage, and sustaining vital functions throughout extended trauma, demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy and physiology that rivaled anything available through conventional medical education. The classification system that Darvulia developed for categorizing subjects according to their suitability for different experimental procedures revealed the extent to which Elizabeth's research had evolved from random violence into systematic investigation, guided by theoretical frameworks that treated human subjects as experimental materials whose value could be determined through careful evaluation of physical characteristics, health status, and psychological profiles. Young women between the ages of 12 and 18 were considered optimal subjects for blood extraction procedures due to the combination of physical vitality and psychological vulnerability that made them both physiologically valuable and operationally manageable. But the research also revealed that different categories of subjects provided different experimental opportunities that could advance understanding of questions about beauty, mortality, and human nature that could not be resolved through investigation of any single population. Older subjects provided comparative data about the relationship between age and blood potency, while subjects from different social classes offered opportunities to investigate whether noble blood possessed inherently different properties from peasant blood that might explain aristocratic superiority in ways that went beyond mere social convention. The systematic documentation that Elizabeth maintained of experimental procedures and results demonstrated her commitment to scientific methodology that would allow for replication and verification of findings through controlled experiments conducted under standardized conditions. The detailed records that have been preserved reveal careful attention to variables such as subject age, health status, time of blood collection, preservation methods, and application techniques that could affect the efficacy of treatments derived from human blood for cosmetic and medicinal purposes. These records also reveal the extent to which Elizabeth's research had expanded beyond simple blood collection into comprehensive investigation of human physiology and psychology that required systematic exploration of subjects' responses to various forms of physical and emotional trauma. The experiments documented in her personal notes included detailed studies of pain tolerance, fear responses, and psychological breakdown patterns that provided data for developing more efficient methods of extracting maximum cooperation and physical resources from subjects whose welfare was considered irrelevant to research objectives. The chemical analysis that Darvulia conducted on blood samples collected under different conditions revealed sophisticated understanding of biological processes that allowed Elizabeth's team to optimize collection and processing procedures for maximum therapeutic benefit. The investigations into factors such as subject emotional state at time of collection, methods of extraction, preservation techniques, and application procedures demonstrated systematic approach to research that treated human blood as complex chemical substance whose properties could be understood and manipulated through careful scientific investigation. But perhaps most significantly, the research revealed that different methods of extraction produced blood with different properties that could serve different purposes in Elizabeth's beauty and health regimen. Blood collected from subjects experiencing extreme fear was found to possess different chemical characteristics from blood collected from subjects in states of rage, resignation, or physical trauma, creating opportunities for developing specialized treatments that could address specific aspects of aging and decay through targeted application of materials with precisely controlled properties. The techniques that Elizabeth's team developed for inducing specific emotional and physical states in subjects prior to blood collection represented innovations in psychological manipulation that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human nature and behavioral control. The procedures they pioneered for creating fear, rage, despair, and other emotional states through systematic application of physical and psychological pressure allowed them to produce blood samples with controlled properties that could be used for different experimental purposes. The apparatus that was constructed for conducting these procedures represented engineering innovations that combined medieval torture devices with contemporary scientific instruments to create equipment that could maintain precise control over subjects' physical and psychological responses throughout extended experimental sessions. The mechanisms developed for restraint, positioning, blood collection, and vital sign monitoring exceeded anything previously documented in European legal or medical contexts, demonstrating technical sophistication that reflected extensive study and systematic refinement based on empirical observation of results. The preservation and storage systems that Davulia designed for maintaining collected blood at optimal potency revealed extensive knowledge of chemical processes and organic preservation that allowed Elizabeth's research to accumulate substantial quantities of experimental materials for systematic comparison and analysis. The facilities constructed within Castle Čachtice included temperature-controlled storage areas, chemical processing laboratories, and analysis equipment that enabled comprehensive investigation of factors affecting blood chemistry and therapeutic efficacy. But the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's systematic approach to research was the development of procedures for maximizing blood extraction from individual subjects through techniques that maintained vital functions while inflicting trauma designed to produce physiological responses that enhanced blood quality for experimental purposes. The methods documented in her research notes reveal careful study of human anatomy and circulation that enabled her team to collect unprecedented quantities of blood from single subjects while maintaining consciousness and responsiveness throughout procedures that could continue for days. The psychological techniques that were developed for maintaining subject cooperation throughout these extended procedures demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and behavioral control that allowed Elizabeth's team to extract maximum physical resources while minimizing operational complications that might result from resistance, escape attempts, or premature death from trauma. The methods they pioneered for creating psychological dependency, learned helplessness, and emotional attachment between subjects and researchers enabled them to conduct experiments that would otherwise have been impossible due to natural human responses to extreme physical trauma. The refinements that Elizabeth introduced into these procedures over months of systematic experimentation revealed her transition from conventional aristocrat into something approaching professional researcher whose work was guided by scientific methodology and theoretical frameworks rather than random sadism or arbitrary exercise of aristocratic privilege. The evolution of her techniques from crude violence into sophisticated research procedures demonstrated intellectual development that paralleled her growing understanding of possibilities available to someone with unlimited resources, absolute authority, and complete freedom from external moral or legal constraints. The chemistry of cruelty that Elizabeth and her accomplices developed through systematic investigation of human responses to extreme physical and psychological trauma represented innovations in torture that would never be surpassed in their combination of scientific precision and methodical application of principles derived from careful study of human nature and capability. The procedures they pioneered for extracting maximum value from human subjects while maintaining operational security and research validity established methodologies that transformed systematic murder into legitimate scientific investigation, serving purposes that transcended individual welfare in favor of knowledge that could revolutionize understanding of beauty, mortality, and human potential. The laboratory that Castle Čachtice had become through Elizabeth's systematic development of research capabilities represented more than just facility for conducting experiments. It was institutional innovation that created alternative moral universe where human subjects could be treated as experimental materials without ethical conflict because their destruction served purposes too important to be limited by conventional humanitarian concerns. The chemistry of cruelty that operated within these walls had transformed systematic violence into scientific methodology that promised benefits too valuable to be constrained by mere moral considerations about individual suffering or social justice. Chapter 6. The Beauty Industry of Death. The systematic expansion of Elizabeth's research operations required the development of recruitment networks that could provide steady supplies of subjects while maintaining the fiction that her activities remained within acceptable bounds of aristocratic authority and household management. The crude methods that had characterized her early acquisition of peasant servants were replaced by sophisticated strategies that exploited social vulnerabilities and economic desperation throughout her territories to attract potential subjects who would enter her service voluntarily and disappear without creating suspicions that might attract unwanted investigation from external authorities. The transformation of subject recruitment from opportunistic selection of existing servants into systematic marketing campaign designed to attract specific categories of potential victims represented Elizabeth's recognition that sustainable research would require institutional approaches that could operate indefinitely without exhausting available populations or creating patterns that might reveal the true purposes of her employment offers. The strategies that emerged from careful study of regional social dynamics and economic conditions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of peasant psychology that allowed her agents to identify and exploit vulnerabilities that made resistance to recruitment virtually impossible. The centerpiece of these recruitment efforts was the establishment of what appeared to be a legitimate educational institution that promised to provide valuable training in domestic arts, literacy, and social graces that could prepare ambitious young women from peasant families for prestigious employment in noble households throughout the Habsburg domains. The school that Elizabeth founded at Castle Čachtice was marketed throughout northern Hungary as opportunity for daughters of respectable but impoverished families to escape the limitations of rural poverty through acquisition of skills that could lead to careers as governesses, housekeepers, or wives to prosperous merchants and artisans. The promises made to attract students to this institution were carefully crafted to appeal to universal parental desires for daughters' advancement, while addressing specific economic pressures that affected different categories of families throughout Elizabeth's territories. For agricultural families struggling with poor harvests or excessive feudal obligations, the school offered immediate relief from the costs of maintaining daughters who consumed resources without contributing labour that could improve family economic circumstances. For artisan families seeking to elevate their social position, the education promised could provide daughters with cultural refinement that might attract marriage proposals from men whose prosperity required wives with sophisticated household management capabilities. But most effectively, Elizabeth's recruitment campaigns targeted families whose circumstances created particular vulnerability to offers that promised social advancement through educational opportunity. The daughters of impoverished minor nobility, whose inherited status prevented them from accepting employment beneath their rank, while their families lacked resources to provide dowries sufficient for appropriate marriages, proved especially susceptible to arguments that proper education could restore their prospects for advantageous relationships with families whose wealth could compensate for their lack of financial resources. The educational curriculum that was advertised for the school at Castle Čachtice reflected careful study of contemporary pedagogical theory and aristocratic cultural expectations that would make the institution appear legitimate to families and communities whose daughters were being recruited for purposes that had nothing to do with education or career preparation. The courses offered included instruction in languages, music, dancing, household management, and religious studies that were considered essential components of proper feminine education among the European nobility and wealthy merchant classes. But more importantly, the school's marketing materials emphasized opportunities for students to observe and participate in the daily life of one of Hungary's most prestigious noble households, providing practical experience in aristocratic customs and social relationships that could not be obtained through conventional education, but would prove invaluable for young women seeking employment or marriage within elevated social circles. This promise of direct access to Elizabeth herself and her aristocratic lifestyle proved irresistibly attractive to families who understood that such opportunities were normally available only to daughters of established noble families. The selection criteria that Elizabeth's agents employed for choosing students revealed the extent to which educational pretenses concealed systematic evaluation of potential subjects according to characteristics that were relevant to research rather than pedagogical objectives. The application process that families were required to complete included detailed information about candidates' physical health, family medical history, and personal characteristics that were ostensibly necessary for determining suitability for demanding educational programs, but actually served to identify subjects whose blood quality and physical attributes would make them particularly valuable for experimental purposes. Young women between the ages of 14 and 18 were preferred because their physiological development provided optimal blood chemistry, while their psychological immaturity made them easier to control through authority relationships disguised as educational mentorship. Candidates from families with histories of longevity and good health were prioritized because their genetic background suggested superior blood quality that might enhance the effectiveness of treatments derived from their physical resources. But perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's recruitment efforts specifically targeted young women whose personal circumstances created emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure cooperation throughout procedures that would gradually escalate from conventional educational activities into systematic exploitation and eventual murder. Orphans, daughters from families with histories of mental illness or social disgrace, and young women who had experienced romantic disappointments or family conflicts were considered optimal candidates because their psychological needs for acceptance and belonging could be satisfied through carefully managed relationships with authority figures who provided emotional support while gradually normalizing increasingly extreme forms of abuse. The transportation arrangements that Elizabeth developed for bringing selected students to Castle Čachtice were designed to minimize contact between new arrivals and local communities that might notice patterns or raise questions about the fate of young women who entered the school but never returned to their families or appeared in employment elsewhere. The students were transported in small groups during different seasons and through different routes that prevented the development of communication networks between their families or communities that might compare experiences and recognize concerning patterns. Upon arrival at Castle Čachtice, the new students were integrated into what appeared to be legitimate educational programs that provided genuine instruction in domestic arts and cultural refinement, while gradually introducing them to research activities disguised as advanced training in household management and aristocratic customs. The curriculum that was actually implemented combined real educational content with systematic conditioning designed to break down psychological resistance to authority and normalize acceptance of physical examination and discipline that would eventually escalate into experimental procedures. The isolation techniques that Elizabeth employed to prevent students from maintaining contact with their families or developing supportive relationships among themselves demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that enabled her to maintain control over subjects while preventing the formation of group solidarity that might enable resistance to increasingly extreme treatment. Each student was assigned individual schedules and responsibilities that minimized contact with others while maximizing dependency on instructors who represented their only sources of emotional support and practical guidance. The gradual escalation from educational activities to experimental procedures was managed through carefully planned progression that introduced each element of the research process as natural extension of previous training rather than fundamental change in program objectives. Physical examinations were presented as health assessments necessary for designing individualized educational programs. Blood sampling was introduced as medical monitoring required for ensuring student welfare during demanding academic schedules. Extended isolation and physical restraint were justified as disciplinary measures necessary for correcting behavioral problems that interfered with educational progress. But the most effective element of Elizabeth's systematic approach to subject conditioning was the development of reward and punishment systems that created psychological dependencies while normalizing acceptance of treatment that would have seemed obviously abusive if introduced suddenly rather than through gradual progression from conventional educational discipline. Students who cooperated with increasingly invasive procedures received privileges, personal attention, and emotional support that satisfied their needs for acceptance and belonging, while those who resisted faced isolation and punishment that made compliance appear preferable to continued rebellion. The documentation that Elizabeth maintained of student progress through educational programs toward full participation in research activities revealed systematic approach to psychological manipulation that treated human subjects as experimental materials whose resistance could be overcome through methodical application of behavioral control techniques. The records that have been preserved include detailed observations of individual psychological profiles, responses to various forms of conditioning, and optimal approaches for managing different personality types throughout the transition from voluntary participation in educational activities to involuntary subjection to experimental procedures. The success of these recruitment and conditioning strategies enabled Elizabeth to maintain steady supplies of high-quality subjects while preserving the appearance of operating legitimate educational institution that served conventional social purposes rather than facilitating systematic murder conducted for experimental objectives. The beauty industry of death that she had created through systematic exploitation of social vulnerabilities and educational aspirations represented innovation in organized violence that combined institutional respectability with operational efficiency to support research activities that required hundreds of subjects while maintaining perfect secrecy about methods and purposes that could never be revealed to external authorities. The school at Castle Čachtice had become more than just recruitment mechanism for Elizabeth's research. It was institutional innovation that transformed systematic murder into socially acceptable activity that appeared to serve legitimate educational and charitable purposes, while actually facilitating investigation of questions about beauty, mortality, and human nature that could only be explored through methods that treated human subjects as expendable resources, whose destruction was justified by knowledge too valuable to be constrained by conventional moral limitations. Chapter 7. The Castle of Screams. The daily routine that characterized life at Castle Čachtice during the peak years of Elizabeth's research operations reflected the systematic organization of activities designed to maximize experimental productivity while maintaining operational security and psychological control over subjects whose cooperation was essential for conducting procedures that might continue for days or weeks before reaching their inevitable fatal conclusions. The schedule that governed castle life combined elements of conventional aristocratic household management with specialized requirements created by research activities that demanded precise timing, careful resource allocation, and constant monitoring of subjects whose physical and psychological conditions affected the quality of experimental results. The morning hours at Castle Čachtice began with activities that appeared entirely conventional to external observers who might visit the castle on business or social occasions. Elizabeth maintained the fiction of operating a prestigious educational institution by conducting morning lessons in languages, music, and domestic arts that provided genuine instruction to students who had not yet been selected for advancement to more specialized training programs. These public educational activities served multiple purposes, providing legitimate cover for the presence of numerous young women within the castle, while allowing Elizabeth to evaluate student capabilities and psychological profiles before making final selections for research participation. But beneath this veneer of conventional aristocratic education, the castle operated according to schedules and priorities that reflected the systematic requirements of conducting experimental procedures on human subjects whose physical resources were being systematically harvested while maintaining their consciousness and cooperation throughout increasingly extreme forms of trauma. The afternoon hours were reserved for what Elizabeth euphemistically termed advanced instruction, activities that took place in the specialized chambers that had been constructed in the castle's lower levels, where soundproofing and drainage systems enabled research to proceed without interruption from external concerns about noise or sanitation. The architectural modifications that had been implemented throughout Castle Čachtice to support Elizabeth's research operations represented innovations in building design that combined practical necessity with psychological manipulation to create environments optimized for conducting systematic torture while maintaining subjects' mental stability throughout procedures that might otherwise result in psychological breakdown that would interfere with experimental objectives. The chambers where research was conducted had been equipped with restraint mechanisms that prevented subject movement while allowing complete access to all areas of the body, temperature control systems that could maintain optimal conditions for blood collection and preservation, and lighting arrangements that enabled precise observation of physiological responses while creating atmospheric conditions that enhanced psychological control over subjects. The soundproofing that had been installed throughout these experimental facilities represented engineering innovations that enabled Elizabeth's team to conduct research without creating noise levels that might attract unwanted attention from castle staff, who were not members of the inner circle or visitors who might arrive unexpectedly on legitimate business. The acoustic isolation that characterized these chambers also served important psychological functions, creating sensory environments that intensified subjects' awareness of their complete dependence on their captors, while eliminating external stimuli that might provide emotional comfort or hope for rescue from their circumstances. But perhaps most significantly, the systematic organization of castle life during these peak research years reflected Elizabeth's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics that enabled her to maintain operational security while managing complex relationships among inner circle members, research subjects, conventional servants, and external visitors whose different roles and knowledge levels required careful coordination to prevent accidental revelation of activities that could never be acknowledged or justified to outside authorities. The hierarchical structure that Elizabeth established for managing castle operations created clear distinctions between different categories of personnel, while ensuring that information about research activities remained restricted to individuals whose psychological profiles and personal circumstances guaranteed absolute loyalty, regardless of how extreme the procedures became. Members of the inner circle who participated directly in experimental procedures were provided with substantial financial rewards, elevated social status, and emotional satisfactions that made continued participation more attractive than rebellion or betrayal, that would result in loss of privileges and probable execution for complicity in activities that exceeded legal definitions of acceptable aristocratic authority. The conventional servants who maintained castle operations without direct involvement in research activities were selected for psychological characteristics that made them unlikely to investigate unusual sounds, odours, or activities that might indicate purposes beyond normal household management. These individuals were typically older women whose experience in aristocratic service had taught them that curiosity about their employer's private activities was professionally dangerous, or younger servants whose limited intelligence and complete economic dependence made them unlikely to question arrangements that provided steady employment and adequate living conditions within one of Hungary's most prestigious noble households. The management of research subjects themselves required systematic approaches to psychological manipulation that could maintain cooperation and prevent organized resistance throughout procedures that gradually escalated from uncomfortable medical examinations to systematic torture and eventual murder conducted for experimental purposes. Elizabeth's team developed techniques for creating emotional dependencies between subjects and their captors, while preventing the formation of supportive relationships among victims that might enable collective resistance or coordinated escape attempts. The conditioning procedures that were employed to prepare subjects for participation in research activities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology that enabled Elizabeth's team to overcome natural resistance to extreme physical trauma through systematic application of reward and punishment cycles designed to break down individual identity and replace autonomous decision-making with complete submission to authority figures who controlled every aspect of daily existence. The techniques they developed for creating learned helplessness, emotional dependency, and psychological fragmentation represented innovations in behavioral control that exceeded anything previously documented in European contexts. The daily schedule that governed research activities reflected careful attention to physiological and psychological factors that affected the quality of experimental results while ensuring optimal productivity from human resources whose value was determined by their ability to provide blood and tissue samples under controlled conditions. Morning procedures typically focused on subjects who had been prepared through overnight conditioning, designed to create specific emotional states that would enhance blood chemistry for particular experimental purposes. The afternoon sessions were reserved for more intensive procedures that required extended time periods and complete privacy from interruption by routine castle activities. These research periods often continued late into the evening hours, when darkness provided additional concealment for activities that generated sounds and odours that might attract unwanted attention from local communities if conducted during daylight hours when peasants working in nearby fields might notice unusual circumstances at the castle. The evening hours at Castle Čachtice were dedicated to processing and preservation of materials collected during the day's experimental procedures, activities that required specialized knowledge and equipment for maintaining blood samples and tissue specimens at optimal condition for analysis and application. The facilities that Darvulia had designed for these purposes represented innovations in organic preservation that combined traditional alchemical techniques with contemporary scientific methods to create storage and processing capabilities that exceeded anything available through conventional medical or research institutions. But perhaps most remarkably, Elizabeth herself maintained an elaborate social schedule that required her to appear regularly at court functions, religious services and aristocratic gatherings, where her behaviour had to remain completely consistent with conventional expectations for someone of her rank and reputation. The psychological compartmentalization that enabled her to transition seamlessly between systematic torture of research subjects and charming conversation with noble peers demonstrated personality characteristics that combined extreme intelligence with complete absence of normal human empathy or moral constraint. The entertainment that Elizabeth provided for distinguished visitors to Castle Čachtice during these peak research years revealed her sophisticated understanding of aristocratic psychology that enabled her to maintain her reputation for hospitality and cultural refinement, while conducting systematic murder in chambers located directly beneath the social areas where she hosted elaborate dinners and musical performances for some of the most prominent figures in Hungarian society. The success of these deception strategies demonstrated Elizabeth's remarkable ability to manage complex social and operational requirements simultaneously, while maintaining perfect emotional control throughout circumstances that would have overwhelmed anyone whose personality was constrained by conventional moral frameworks or normal human responses to extreme violence. The castle of screams that Čachtice had become through systematic organisation of research activities operated with clockwork precision that reflected years of refinement and optimization based on empirical observation of results and continuous improvement of methods designed to maximize experimental productivity while maintaining operational security. The daily routine that characterized life within these walls represented more than just systematic cruelty. It was institutional innovation that created alternative moral universe where human subjects could be treated as experimental materials without ethical conflict because their destruction served research purposes too important to be limited by conventional humanitarian concerns. The castle that had once symbolized aristocratic power and cultural refinement had been transformed into a laboratory where the boundaries between legitimate scientific investigation and systematic murder had been eliminated through research methodology that promised knowledge too valuable to be constrained by mere moral considerations about individual suffering or social justice. The screams that echoed through the specialized chambers of Castle Čachtice during these peak years represented not just evidence of systematic torture, but documentation of research activities that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge about beauty, mortality, and the relationship between noble blood and common humanity through investigation methods that treated human subjects as expendable resources whose destruction was justified by benefits too significant to be limited by conventional legal or ethical restrictions. Chapter 8. The Blood Baths. The ritual that would become the most notorious aspect of Elizabeth's systematic research into the rejuvenating properties of human blood evolved gradually from simple topical application into elaborate ceremonial procedures that combined practical experimentation with psychological symbolism, designed to enhance both the physical effectiveness and emotional satisfaction of treatments derived from systematic exploitation of human subjects. The crude methods that had characterized her early experiments with individual servants had been refined through years of systematic investigation into sophisticated procedures that maximized both the quantity and quality of blood available for therapeutic applications, while creating sensory experiences that satisfied psychological needs for power and control that mere cosmetic benefits could not provide. The bathing chambers that were constructed within the specialized facilities at Castle Čachtice represented architectural innovations that combined engineering requirements for blood collection and preservation with aesthetic considerations designed to create environments that enhanced the psychological impact of procedures that transformed systematic murder into transcendent experiences of power over life and death itself. The custom-designed vessels that were installed for Elizabeth's exclusive use incorporated heating systems that could maintain optimal temperatures for extended immersion, circulation mechanisms that prevented coagulation during lengthy sessions, and drainage systems that enabled efficient processing of materials after therapeutic applications were completed. But the true sophistication of Elizabeth's bathing rituals lay not in their engineering complexity alone, but in the systematic methodology that governed every aspect of procedures designed to optimize the therapeutic benefits derived from human blood while creating psychological experiences that satisfied needs for dominance and control that conventional aristocratic privileges could no longer adequately address. The selection criteria that were employed for choosing subjects whose blood would be used for bathing purposes reflected extensive research into factors that affected blood chemistry and therapeutic efficacy, including age, health status, emotional state at time of extraction, and methods of collection that could influence the properties of materials used for cosmetic and medical applications. Young women between the ages of 14 and 18 were considered optimal sources for bathing blood because their physiological development provided maximum concentrations of hormones and nutrients that Elizabeth's research had identified as essential components of effective anti-aging treatments. The health screening procedures that were conducted to evaluate potential subjects included detailed medical examinations designed to identify candidates whose blood quality would justify the substantial investment of time and resources required for conducting full bathing rituals with their elaborate preparation and ceremonial requirements. But more importantly, Elizabeth's research had revealed that the emotional and psychological states of subjects at the time of blood collection significantly affected the therapeutic properties of materials derived from their physical resources. Blood collected from subjects experiencing extreme terror was found to possess different chemical characteristics from blood collected during states of rage, despair, or resigned acceptance, creating opportunities for developing specialized treatments that could address different aspects of aging and physical decay through targeted application of materials with precisely controlled properties determined by the psychological conditioning of their sources. The preparation procedures that were developed for creating optimal emotional states in subjects selected for bathing rituals demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology that enabled Elizabeth's team to induce specific mental and emotional conditions that would enhance blood chemistry while providing psychological satisfaction for the researchers who derived pleasure from systematic exploration of human responses to extreme physical and emotional trauma. The techniques they pioneered for creating and maintaining terror, rage, or despair throughout extended periods of consciousness enabled them to collect blood samples with controlled properties while conducting psychological experiments that served research objectives beyond simple material collection. The ceremonial aspects of Elizabeth's bathing rituals reflected her sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical sensation and psychological experience that enabled simple therapeutic procedures to become transcendent expressions of power that satisfied emotional needs for dominance and control while providing genuine medical benefits derived from systematic application of human blood with properties optimized through careful selection and preparation of subjects. The elaborate protocols that governed these sessions combined practical requirements for blood collection and application with symbolic elements designed to enhance the psychological impact of procedures that transformed Elizabeth from conventional aristocrat into something approaching goddess whose power over life and death exceeded anything available through mere social position or political authority. The timing of bathing sessions was coordinated with astronomical and seasonal cycles that Elizabeth's research had identified as factors affecting both the therapeutic efficacy of blood treatments and the psychological satisfaction derived from procedures that connected her directly to cosmic forces governing life, death, and renewal. The chambers where these rituals were conducted were equipped with specialized lighting that could create atmospheric effects designed to enhance the sensory experience of immersion in human blood while providing optimal conditions for observing physiological responses to treatments that promised to halt or reverse the aging processes that threatened her beauty and vitality. The duration of individual bathing sessions was determined through systematic experimentation designed to identify optimal exposure times that could maximize therapeutic benefits while preventing adverse reactions that might compromise the effectiveness of treatments or create health problems that could interfere with regular application of procedures that required consistent implementation over extended periods to produce cumulative effects. The research that Elizabeth conducted into factors affecting treatment efficacy included detailed documentation of skin absorption rates, temperature sensitivity, and chemical interactions that could influence the biological processes through which human blood was supposed to provide rejuvenating effects. But perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's bathing rituals incorporated systematic collection and analysis of data, designed to document the effectiveness of different treatment protocols while identifying variables that could be modified to enhance therapeutic outcomes. The detailed records that she maintained of bathing sessions included information about subject characteristics, blood collection methods, preparation procedures, application techniques, and physiological responses that enabled continuous refinement of protocols based on empirical observation rather than theoretical speculation about optimal treatment approaches. The psychological effects of regular participation in bathing rituals extended far beyond whatever physical benefits Elizabeth derived from topical application of human blood to encompass fundamental changes in her understanding of her own nature and capabilities that transformed her from conventional aristocrat into something approaching supernatural being whose power over human life enabled her to transcend normal limitations of mortality and physical decay. The systematic immersion in blood derived from subjects whose lives she had taken for therapeutic purposes created psychological experiences of absolute power that satisfied needs for dominance and control while reinforcing her belief that her superior nature justified whatever methods were necessary to maintain her beauty and vitality. The sensory experiences associated with bathing in human blood provided forms of physical and emotional satisfaction that exceeded anything available through conventional aristocratic pleasures, while creating psychological dependencies that made regular repetition of procedures essential for maintaining the sense of power and transcendence that had become central to Elizabeth's identity and self-understanding. The warmth of fresh blood against her skin, the visual impact of crimson liquid surrounding her body, and the knowledge that her beauty was being preserved through systematic exploitation of inferior beings combined to create experiences that were simultaneously physical, emotional, and spiritual in their intensity and significance. But the practical requirements of conducting regular bathing rituals with fresh human blood necessitated systematic organization of subject acquisition and preparation that required substantial resources and coordinated effort from multiple accomplices whose skills and loyalty enabled Elizabeth to maintain steady supplies of optimal materials while preserving operational security about activities that could never be acknowledged or justified to external authorities. The logistics of coordinating subject selection, blood collection, preservation, and application required institutional capabilities that exceeded anything previously documented in the history of systematic violence. The preservation techniques that were developed for maintaining blood at optimal condition between collection and application represented innovations in organic chemistry that combined traditional alchemical knowledge with contemporary scientific methods to create storage and processing capabilities that enabled Elizabeth to accumulate substantial quantities of materials for systematic use in therapeutic applications. The facilities that were constructed for these purposes included temperature-controlled storage areas, chemical processing laboratories, and specialized equipment for maintaining blood chemistry at levels that would provide maximum therapeutic benefit. The evolution of Elizabeth's bathing rituals from simple cosmetic applications into elaborate ceremonial procedures reflected her growing understanding of the relationship between physical treatment and psychological experience that enabled systematic murder to become transcendent expression of power over life and death itself. The blood that filled her baths represented not just therapeutic materials, but symbols of absolute authority over human existence that satisfied needs for dominance and control, while providing genuine medical benefits that justified whatever methods were necessary to maintain supplies of materials whose properties could only be obtained through systematic exploitation of living subjects. The chambers where these rituals were conducted had become more than just facilities for therapeutic treatment. They were temples where systematic violence was transformed into sacred ceremony that connected Elizabeth directly to forces governing beauty, mortality, and human potential through procedures that enabled her to transcend normal limitations of aristocratic power while achieving forms of physical and psychological satisfaction that were impossible through conventional means. The bloodbaths that made her name legendary represented the culmination of research activities that had transformed systematic murder into legitimate therapeutic procedure, serving purposes too important to be limited by mere humanitarian concerns about individual suffering or social justice. Chapter 9. The Noble Victims. The systematic expansion of Elizabeth's research operations had been sustained for years through careful recruitment of subjects from peasant families, whose social position made their disappearance both practically manageable and legally inconsequential, according to the feudal customs that governed relationships between aristocrats and commoners in the Kingdom of Hungary. The daughters of agricultural labourers, domestic servants and rural artisans could vanish without creating complications that might attract investigation from external authorities, since their legal status as subjects rather than citizens meant that their welfare was entirely subject to the discretion of noble lords who possessed absolute authority over their lives and deaths. But by 1609, the relentless appetite of Elizabeth's research program had begun to exhaust the available supply of peasant subjects, whose disappearance could be explained through conventional mechanisms of aristocratic employment and household management. The recruitment networks that had operated successfully for years were encountering increasing difficulty in attracting suitable candidates, as families throughout her territories became reluctant to send daughters to educational opportunities that seemed to result in permanent separation from their communities, without evidence of successful career placement or advantageous marriages that had supposedly justified the risks of accepting employment in noble households. The demographic pressures created by years of systematic subject acquisition were compounded by practical limitations on the number of peasant girls who possessed the physical characteristics and health status that Elizabeth's research had identified as essential for producing blood with optimal therapeutic properties. The selection criteria that had been refined through extensive experimentation required subjects whose youth, beauty, and vitality met increasingly demanding standards, while their family backgrounds provided reasonable assurance of genetic superiority that would translate into blood chemistry capable of delivering genuine rejuvenating effects. The solution that Elizabeth developed for addressing these supply constraints represented a fundamental shift in operational strategy that would ultimately prove to be the fatal error that brought her entire enterprise to the attention of authorities whose power exceeded her own ability to control or intimidate. Instead of restricting recruitment to peasant families whose social position made them vulnerable to aristocratic exploitation, she began targeting daughters of lesser nobility whose blood might possess inherently superior properties, while their educational backgrounds and cultural refinement would make them more suitable companions during the extended procedures that had become increasingly important components of her research methodology. The theoretical justification for this expansion into noble recruitment reflected Elizabeth's evolving understanding of the relationship between social rank and blood quality that had emerged from years of systematic experimentation with subjects from different social backgrounds. Her research had suggested that blood derived from aristocratic sources possessed chemical and physiological properties that were distinctly superior to materials collected from peasant subjects, even when other factors such as age and health status were controlled for comparison purposes. These findings appeared to confirm traditional beliefs about the inherent superiority of noble blood, while providing scientific evidence for social hierarchies that had previously been justified through religious doctrine and political theory rather than empirical investigation. The superior therapeutic effects that Elizabeth observed from treatments derived from aristocratic blood seemed to validate her conviction that her own noble nature entitled her to exploit inferior beings for purposes that served the preservation and enhancement of genetic superiority that represented humanity's highest achievements. But the practical implementation of recruitment strategies targeting lesser nobility required operational modifications that created vulnerabilities and complications that had not characterized her previous activities with peasant subjects. The daughters of impoverished noble families could not simply disappear without explanation, in the manner that had proven effective with commoners, whose absence might not be noticed or investigated by anyone with sufficient authority to demand accountability from aristocratic employers. The families whose daughters Elizabeth began targeting for recruitment possessed legal standing and social connections that enabled them to pursue formal investigations when their children failed to return from educational opportunities or employment arrangements that had been negotiated through official channels. Unlike peasant families, who possessed no recourse against noble employers whose authority was absolute within their territories, lesser nobility retained rights and privileges that included access to legal remedies and political influence that could be employed to demand explanations for circumstances that violated conventional expectations about aristocratic behaviour and responsibility. The recruitment methods that Elizabeth employed for attracting noble subjects necessarily involved more elaborate deceptions and formal commitments that created documentary evidence of her involvement in arrangements that could be investigated by external authorities if suspicious circumstances warranted official inquiry. The contracts and correspondence associated with these recruitment efforts established legal relationships and obligations that could not be dismissed or concealed through the informal mechanisms that had proven adequate for managing peasant disappearances. But perhaps most dangerously, the targeting of noble victims brought Elizabeth's activities to the attention of families whose social position and political connections enabled them to pursue investigations through channels that extended beyond her territorial jurisdiction and personal authority. When daughters of lesser nobility began disappearing from educational programs at Castle Čachtice, their families possessed both the legal standing and the social networks necessary to bring their concerns to the attention of royal officials whose authority superseded Elizabeth's feudal privileges and whose investigative capabilities could penetrate deceptions that had previously proven adequate for concealing systematic murder from local oversight. The specific case that would ultimately trigger comprehensive investigation of Elizabeth's activities involved Anna Darvulia, daughter of a minor noble family whose financial circumstances had made them vulnerable to recruitment offers. that promised educational and social opportunities for their daughter, while providing immediate economic relief through generous payments that exceeded anything available through conventional employment or marriage arrangements. Anna's family background included distant kinship relationships with more prominent noble houses whose political influence could be mobilized if circumstances warranted intervention by authorities whose power exceeded Elizabeth's ability to control or intimidate. The recruitment of Anna d'Avulia had been conducted through the same elaborate educational pretenses that had proven effective with previous noble subjects, but her family's social connections had enabled them to verify aspects of the arrangements through independent sources who possessed detailed knowledge of conditions at Castle Čachtice and Elizabeth's reputation for activities that exceeded conventional expectations about aristocratic behaviour and responsibility toward young women placed in their care for educational or employment purposes. When Anna failed to return from her supposed educational programme according to the schedule that had been established in formal agreements between her family and Elizabeth's representatives, her relatives possessed both the determination and the capabilities necessary to pursue systematic investigation of circumstances that might explain her prolonged absence without satisfactory communication or evidence of educational progress that had supposedly justified the substantial investments they had made in her advancement opportunities. The investigation that Anna's family initiated into conditions at Castle Čachtice revealed disturbing patterns of behaviour and circumstantial evidence that suggested activities far exceeding anything that could be justified through conventional aristocratic privileges or educational methodologies. The testimonies they collected from former servants, local merchants, and regional administrators provided circumstantial evidence of systematic violence and possible murder that warranted investigation by authorities whose power exceeded Elizabeth's territorial jurisdiction and feudal immunities. But most significantly, Anna's disappearance occurred during a period when political circumstances in the Kingdom of Hungary had created opportunities for royal intervention in aristocratic affairs that had previously been considered immune from external oversight due to feudal customs and traditional privileges that protected noble families from investigation by authorities whose jurisdiction was limited by constitutional arrangements favouring aristocratic autonomy. The financial difficulties that were affecting the Habsburg crown created incentives for pursuing investigations that might result in confiscation of properties and assets belonging to nobles whose activities violated laws that could justify legal proceedings resulting in forfeiture of estates and revenues. The convergence of increased scrutiny resulting from noble victims with political circumstances that made royal intervention both possible and profitable created the conditions that would ultimately expose Elizabeth's systematic research program to investigation by authorities whose power exceeded her ability to control outcomes through the intimidation and bribery that had previously proven adequate for managing local oversight of her activities. The fatal error of expanding recruitment into aristocratic families had created vulnerabilities that would prove impossible to contain once formal investigations began. The noble victims whose blood had provided superior therapeutic materials for Elizabeth's research had also provided the legal and political mechanisms that would ultimately destroy everything she had built through years of systematic experimentation with human subjects. Their superior social position, which had made them valuable for research purposes, had also made their disappearance impossible to conceal through the informal methods that had proven adequate for managing peasant casualties, whose deaths had sustained her operations for years without attracting external attention. The transformation of systematic murder from invisible crime against disposable subjects into visible scandal involving prominent families represented the beginning of the end for Elizabeth's research enterprise, as the very success of her expansion into noble recruitment created the political and legal complications that would ultimately expose her activities to investigation by authorities whose power exceeded her own, while providing evidence that would justify proceedings resulting in the destruction of everything she had achieved through years of systematic violence conducted with scientific precision and unlimited resources. Chapter 10. The Perfect Machine. By the winter of 1609, Elizabeth's systematic research operations had achieved a level of organisational sophistication and operational efficiency that transformed Castle Čachtice into what could only be described as an industrial facility for the processing of human subjects whose lives were converted into therapeutic materials with mechanical precision that exceeded anything previously documented in the history of systematic violence. The crude experiments that had characterized her early investigations had evolved into comprehensive institutional capabilities that could manage every aspect of subject acquisition, conditioning, exploitation, and disposal according to standardized procedures that maximized both the quantity and quality of materials produced while maintaining operational security that had protected her activities from external detection for over 5 years. The administrative systems that governed daily operations at the castle during this period reflected Elizabeth's sophisticated understanding of organizational management and quality control that enabled her to coordinate complex activities involving multiple personnel with different responsibilities, while ensuring consistent results that met the demanding standards required by research objectives that could not tolerate inefficiency or waste in the utilization of human resources whose acquisition represented substantial investments of time, money, and effort. The personnel structure that had been developed to manage these operations created clear hierarchies and specialized roles that prevented any individual accomplice from possessing complete knowledge of activities that might enable them to compromise operational security through betrayal or careless revelation of information that could expose the true nature of Elizabeth's research program. Members of the inner circle who participated directly in experimental procedures were provided with detailed knowledge only of their specific responsibilities, while remaining ignorant of aspects of the operation that did not directly concern their assigned tasks. The scheduling systems that coordinated subject processing with Elizabeth's social obligations and administrative responsibilities demonstrated remarkable logistical sophistication that enabled her to maintain appearances of conventional aristocratic behavior while conducting systematic murder on an unprecedented scale. The timing of research activities was carefully planned to avoid conflicts with court appearances, religious observances, and social engagements that required her presence in contexts where any evidence of her true activities would create suspicions that could trigger investigations by authorities whose power exceeded her ability to control outcomes. The procurement networks that supplied subjects for Elizabeth's research had been refined through years of experience into sophisticated recruitment mechanisms that could identify and attract optimal candidates while maintaining the fiction that Castle Čachtice operated legitimate educational and employment programs rather than facilities for systematic exploitation of human resources. The agents who managed recruitment activities throughout Elizabeth's territories possessed detailed knowledge of regional demographics and family circumstances that enabled them to target households whose daughters would provide superior research materials, while their disappearance could be explained through conventional mechanisms of aristocratic employment and career advancement. The conditioning procedures that were employed to prepare subjects for participation in research activities had been systematized through extensive experimentation into standardized protocols that could reliably produce desired psychological and physiological states, while minimizing operational complications that might result from resistance, escape attempts, or premature death from trauma. The techniques that Elizabeth's team had developed for creating learned helplessness, emotional dependency, and complete submission to authority represented innovations in behavioral control that enabled them to conduct extended research procedures with subjects who actively cooperated in their own exploitation and eventual murder. The experimental facilities that had been constructed within Castle Čachtice represented architectural innovations that combined engineering requirements for blood collection and preservation with operational needs for maintaining multiple subjects in various stages of conditioning and exploitation simultaneously. The specialized chambers that served as laboratories were equipped with restraint mechanisms, monitoring equipment, and preservation systems that enabled researchers to conduct systematic investigation of human physiology while maintaining precise control over environmental conditions that affected both subject responses and material quality. The documentation systems that recorded experimental procedures and results demonstrated Elizabeth's commitment to scientific methodology that would enable replication and verification of findings through controlled experiments conducted under standardized conditions. The detailed records that were maintained of subject characteristics, conditioning procedures, experimental protocols, and physiological responses provided comprehensive databases that supported continuous refinement of research methodologies while documenting discoveries that advanced understanding of human physiology and blood chemistry. The quality control procedures that governed material collection and processing ensured that blood and tissue samples met demanding standards for purity and potency, while preventing contamination or degradation that could compromise therapeutic applications. The systematic approaches that were employed for evaluating subject health, monitoring physiological responses during exploitation, and preserving collected materials represented innovations in organic chemistry and medical technology that exceeded capabilities available through conventional research institutions. But perhaps most remarkably, Elizabeth had developed procedures for coordinating research activities with the social and administrative requirements of maintaining her position as one of Hungary's most prominent aristocrats, whose public reputation for charitable activities and cultural refinement provided perfect camouflage for systematic murder conducted on an industrial scale. The psychological compartmentalization that enabled her to transition seamlessly between torturing research subjects and hosting elegant social gatherings demonstrated personality characteristics that combined exceptional intelligence with complete absence of normal human empathy or moral constraint. The entertainment programs that Elizabeth organized for distinguished visitors during this period revealed her sophisticated understanding of aristocratic psychology that enabled her to maintain social relationships and political alliances while conducting activities that would have horrified even the most hardened military veterans or criminal investigators. The elaborate dinners, musical performances, and cultural exhibitions that she hosted at Castle Čachtice provided evidence of refinement and hospitality that reinforced her reputation for exemplary aristocratic behaviour, while systematic murder proceeded in chambers located directly beneath the social areas where she charmed some of the most prominent figures in European society. The financial systems that supported these operations demonstrated Elizabeth's ability to manage substantial budgets while maintaining detailed accounting of expenditures related to research activities without creating documentary evidence that could reveal the true nature of her investments in equipment, materials, and personnel whose services exceeded anything required for conventional aristocratic household management. The resources that were dedicated to research purposes included not only direct costs for facilities and supplies, but substantial payments to accomplices whose loyalty was maintained through generous compensation that exceeded anything available through legitimate employment opportunities. The security procedures that protected operational information from unauthorized disclosure represented innovations in organizational security that prevented leakage of sensitive information while enabling coordination among multiple personnel whose cooperation was essential for conducting complex research activities. The techniques that Elizabeth employed for managing compartmentalized information, controlling access to restricted areas, and monitoring personnel behavior demonstrated sophisticated understanding of counterintelligence principles that exceeded anything available through conventional military or diplomatic training. The production capabilities that Elizabeth's organization had achieved by 1609 enabled her to process dozens of subjects annually while maintaining blood supplies sufficient for regular therapeutic applications and experimental investigations that advanced her understanding of optimal treatment protocols. The systematic efficiency with which human subjects were converted into research materials represented organizational achievements that combined logistical sophistication with technical innovation to create capabilities that exceeded anything previously documented in European contexts. But the very perfection of Elizabeth's systematic approach to research would ultimately contribute to her downfall by creating organizational capabilities that were too sophisticated to remain concealed indefinitely from authorities whose investigative resources exceeded her ability to control or neutralize. The institutional scale of her operations had grown beyond what could be sustained through the informal mechanisms that had proven adequate for concealing individual murders or occasional disappearances from peasant families, whose social position made them unable to pursue systematic investigation of suspicious circumstances. The perfect machine that Castle Čachtice had become through years of systematic development represented both the culmination of Elizabeth's research ambitions and the creation of evidence that would ultimately expose her activities to investigation by authorities whose power exceeded her ability to prevent or control. The organizational sophistication that had enabled unprecedented research productivity had also created vulnerabilities that could not be eliminated through the methods that had previously proven adequate for maintaining operational security. The documentation systems that had been essential for advancing research objectives would provide comprehensive evidence of systematic murder conducted on an unprecedented scale. The personnel networks that had enabled complex operations would create multiple sources of testimony about activities that exceeded legal definitions of acceptable aristocratic behaviour. The physical facilities that had supported research activities would provide archaeological evidence of systematic violence that could not be explained through conventional mechanisms of household discipline or judicial punishment. The perfect machine that Elizabeth had created through systematic organisation of research capabilities would ultimately become the instrument of her own destruction, as the very efficiency and sophistication that had enabled her research success would provide authorities with irrefutable evidence of criminal activities that exceeded anything previously documented in the history of European aristocratic violence. The mechanical precision with which she had conducted systematic murder would ultimately facilitate her prosecution by providing detailed documentation of crimes that could not be denied or minimized through conventional legal defense strategies. Chapter 11. Whispers in the Hungarian Court. The political landscape of the Kingdom of Hungary in 1610 created circumstances that transformed Elizabeth Báthory from protected aristocrat whose territorial authority had previously shielded her activities from external oversight into vulnerable target whose wealth and power made her attractive subject for royal intervention by Habsburg authorities facing unprecedented financial pressures and political challenges that required innovative solutions to problems that threatened the stability of their Central European domains. The convergence of fiscal crisis, noble resistance to taxation, and growing evidence of systematic criminality within one of Hungary's most prominent aristocratic families created opportunities for King Matthias II to pursue investigation and potential prosecution that could serve multiple political objectives while addressing genuine concerns about activities that exceeded acceptable bounds of feudal authority. The financial difficulties that characterized Habsburg administration throughout the early 17th century had created incentives for identifying revenue sources that could support military operations and administrative expenses without relying on parliamentary taxation that faced increasing resistance from noble assemblies whose cooperation was essential for maintaining political stability in territories that were constantly threatened by Ottoman expansion and internal rebellion. The traditional sources of royal income had proven inadequate for supporting the expanded governmental responsibilities that were required by contemporary military and diplomatic challenges, creating pressure for discovering alternative mechanisms for revenue generation that could operate independently of formal taxation requiring noble consent. The legal precedents that existed for royal confiscation of aristocratic properties in cases involving serious criminal activity provided potential solutions to fiscal problems while addressing legitimate concerns about maintaining royal authority over noble subjects whose power and independence had grown beyond what constitutional arrangements had originally intended to accommodate. The feudal privileges that protected aristocratic families from most forms of royal intervention included exceptions for cases involving activities that exceeded acceptable bounds of noble authority or threatened public order in ways that required direct royal response to maintain governmental credibility and social stability. But the practical implementation of proceedings against someone of Elizabeth's rank and wealth required careful preparation and compelling evidence that could justify actions whose political and legal ramifications would affect relationships between crown and nobility throughout the Habsburg domains. Any investigation of Elizabeth's activities would necessarily involve examination of feudal customs and aristocratic privileges that formed the foundation of political arrangements governing relationships between royal authority and noble autonomy, creating precedents that could affect fundamental constitutional principles throughout Central Europe. The intelligence networks that served Habsburg administrative needs had been collecting reports about unusual activities at Castle Čachtice for several years, but the information available through conventional sources had remained insufficient to justify formal investigation of someone whose social position and political connections made accusations extremely dangerous if they could not be substantiated through evidence that met demanding legal standards. The testimonies of peasant families about missing daughters and disturbing rumours from local communities provided circumstantial evidence that suggested serious problems, but peasant testimony alone could not support legal proceedings against aristocrats whose constitutional protections specifically prevented prosecution based on accusations from social inferiors. The transformation of suspicious circumstances into actionable intelligence occurred when families of missing noble daughters began pursuing systematic investigations that produced evidence of patterns and activities that exceeded anything that could be dismissed as peasant superstition or social resentment against aristocratic privilege. The disappearances of Anna Darvulia and other daughters from lesser noble families created legal and political complications that could not be resolved through informal mechanisms, since their families possessed constitutional rights and social connections that enabled them to demand formal investigation by authorities whose jurisdiction extended beyond Elizabeth's territorial boundaries. The reports that reached King Matthias II through these investigations described activities that, if verified, would represent criminality on a scale that exceeded anything previously documented in European contexts, while involving someone whose wealth and properties could provide substantial financial benefits to royal treasury through confiscation proceedings. The combination of genuine concern about systematic murder with practical interest in Elizabeth's estates created political incentives for pursuing investigation, while providing legal justification for proceedings that could serve multiple governmental objectives simultaneously. The strategic considerations that influenced royal decision-making regarding Elizabeth's case included assessment of political risks and benefits that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of her alleged crimes to encompass broader questions about royal authority over noble subjects, and the precedents that would be established for future conflicts between crown prerogatives and aristocratic privileges. The success or failure of proceedings against Elizabeth would affect Habsburg ability to control noble behaviour throughout their Central European territories, while influencing relationships with other prominent families whose cooperation was essential for maintaining political stability. But perhaps most significantly, the timing of investigation into Elizabeth's activities coincided with broader Habsburg efforts to consolidate royal authority and reduce noble independence that had grown beyond constitutional limits during previous decades of political instability and military crisis. The proceedings against Elizabeth could serve as demonstration of royal power, while providing practical benefits through confiscation of properties, whose revenues would support governmental operations without requiring parliamentary consent or negotiation with noble assemblies whose cooperation could not be guaranteed. The preliminary investigations that were authorized by royal officials revealed evidence that exceeded even the most serious allegations that had been reported through unofficial channels, suggesting systematic criminality that represented fundamental challenge to legal order and social stability that required comprehensive response regardless of Elizabeth's social position or political connections. The testimonies that were collected from former servants, local officials and regional administrators provided corroborating evidence of activities that could not be explained through conventional mechanisms of aristocratic household management or judicial authority. The legal framework that governed proceedings against Elizabeth required careful consideration of constitutional principles and political precedents that would affect relationships between royal authority and noble privileges throughout the Habsburg domains. The charges that could be brought against her needed to reflect both the severity of her alleged crimes and the political requirements for maintaining support from other noble families whose cooperation was essential for implementing any sentence that might result from successful prosecution. The evidence that was accumulating through systematic investigation included not only testimony about specific criminal acts, but documentation of organizational capabilities and systematic procedures that suggested institutional approach to violence that exceeded anything previously encountered in European legal contexts. The facilities, equipment, and administrative systems that had been discovered at Castle Čachtice provided physical evidence of activities that could not be dismissed as isolated incidents or temporary aberrations in otherwise acceptable aristocratic behaviour. The political calculations that influenced royal strategy for managing Elizabeth's case included assessment of potential resistance from other noble families, who might interpret proceedings against her as threats to their own autonomy and constitutional protections. The success of any prosecution would depend on maintaining support from aristocratic allies, while preventing the formation of noble coalitions that could challenge royal authority through constitutional or military means. But the financial incentives created by Elizabeth's wealth provided compelling motivation for pursuing investigation despite political risks. Since her estates represented some of the most valuable properties in the Kingdom of Hungary, whose confiscation could provide revenue sufficient to support major governmental initiatives, while demonstrating royal power to enforce legal authority over even the most prominent noble subjects. The whispers that circulated throughout the Hungarian court during this period reflected growing awareness that Elizabeth's case represented more than ordinary criminal investigation, but fundamental test of constitutional arrangements and political relationships that would affect the balance of power between crown and nobility for generations to come. The precedents established through proceedings against someone of her rank and influence would determine whether royal authority could effectively control noble behaviour when it exceeded acceptable bounds, or whether aristocratic privileges would continue to provide immunity from legal consequences, regardless of the severity of criminal activities. The intelligence networks that served both royal and noble interests ensured that information about developing investigations reached interested parties throughout the political hierarchy, creating pressures and incentives that influenced decision-making processes while affecting the strategic calculations of everyone involved in circumstances whose resolution would have lasting implications for political arrangements throughout Central Europe. The stage was being set for confrontation between royal authority and aristocratic privilege that would test fundamental assumptions about law, justice, and political power in circumstances whose outcome would affect not only Elizabeth's fate, but constitutional principles that governed relationships between rulers and ruled throughout the Habsburg domains. Chapter 12. The Investigator's Arrival. The morning when György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary and the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself, arrived at the gates of Castle Čachtice with a royal warrant authorising comprehensive investigation of activities within Elizabeth Báthory's domains, marked the beginning of the end for the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in European history. Thurzó was no ordinary royal official conducting routine administrative business. He was Elizabeth's own cousin, a man whose family connections and intimate knowledge of her circumstances made him uniquely qualified to distinguish between legitimate aristocratic authority and systematic criminality that exceeded all acceptable bounds of noble privilege. The selection of Thurzó for this delicate and dangerous assignment reflected King Matthias II's sophisticated understanding of the political complexities involved in investigating someone whose social position, family connections, and vast wealth created unprecedented challenges for royal authority attempting to enforce legal constraints on aristocratic behaviour. The appointment of Elizabeth's own kinsman to lead the investigation provided protection against accusations of royal persecution, while ensuring that the proceedings would be conducted by someone whose aristocratic credentials were unquestionable and whose personal integrity was beyond dispute throughout Hungarian noble society. But Thurzó's family relationship with Elizabeth also created emotional and political complications that made his assignment particularly burdensome, since success in documenting her crimes would necessitate destroying someone whose childhood he remembered and whose family honour was intertwined with his own reputation and social standing. The evidence that he would be required to collect and evaluate would either exonerate a kinswoman whose behaviour had been misrepresented by malicious rumours, or confirm that someone bearing his family name had perpetrated atrocities that exceeded anything previously documented in European criminal history. The royal warrant that authorised Thurzó's investigation granted him unprecedented authority to examine any aspects of Elizabeth's activities that might be relevant to allegations of systematic murder, including access to private chambers, personal correspondence, financial records, and witness testimony from anyone within her territories, regardless of their social position or previous obligations to maintain confidentiality about aristocratic household affairs. The scope of his investigative powers exceeded anything normally available to royal officials, reflecting both the severity of the allegations and the political importance of resolving questions about activities that had attracted international attention and threatened Habsburg credibility throughout Central Europe. The timing of Thurzó's arrival at Castle Čachtice was carefully coordinated to maximise the possibility of discovering evidence before Elizabeth could implement whatever contingency plans she might have developed for concealing or destroying materials that could document systematic criminality. The investigation was launched without advance, warning that could enable preparation of deceptions or elimination of witnesses whose testimony might prove damaging, while the speed and comprehensiveness of the proceedings were designed to prevent coordination of resistance that might otherwise compromise the collection of evidence essential for supporting legal proceedings. The initial phases of Thurzó's investigation focused on documenting physical evidence within Castle Čachtice that could corroborate testimonies about systematic violence, while providing concrete proof of activities that exceeded conventional definitions of acceptable aristocratic behaviour. The examination of facilities, equipment, and architectural modifications that had been implemented to support Elizabeth's research operations revealed organisational capabilities and technical sophistication that confirmed allegations of systematic murder conducted on an unprecedented scale. The discovery of specialised chambers equipped with restraint mechanisms, blood collection systems, and preservation facilities provided irrefutable physical evidence of activities designed for systematic torture and murder rather than legitimate household discipline or judicial punishment. The architectural modifications that had been implemented throughout the castle demonstrated substantial investments of time and resources in creating capabilities that could only serve purposes involving systematic exploitation of human subjects for experimental or therapeutic objectives. But perhaps most damning was the documentary evidence that Thurzo discovered in Elizabeth's private chambers, including detailed records of experimental procedures, subject characteristics, and research results that provided comprehensive documentation of systematic murder conducted with scientific methodology and careful attention to optimizing outcomes through controlled experimentation. The meticulous record-keeping that had enabled Elizabeth to advance her research objectives also provided investigators with irrefutable proof of criminal activities that could not be denied or minimized through conventional legal defense strategies. The testimonial evidence that Thurzo collected from members of Elizabeth's inner circle revealed the full extent of organizational capabilities that had enabled systematic murder to continue for years without detection by external authorities. The interviews with Dorothea Sentes, Katerina Benica, Janos Fichko, and other accomplices provided detailed information about recruitment procedures, conditioning techniques, experimental protocols, and disposal methods that documented criminal enterprise whose sophistication exceeded anything previously encountered in European legal contexts. But the collection of this testimony required careful management of psychological and legal factors that could affect both the reliability of information and the safety of witnesses whose cooperation was essential for documenting activities that had involved multiple participants over extended periods. The accomplices whose testimony was crucial for establishing Elizabeth's guilt were themselves complicit in systematic murder that exceeded legal definitions of acceptable behaviour, creating complex legal and ethical questions about immunity, coercion, and credibility that would affect the prosecution strategy and ultimate resolution of the case. The examination of physical remains that were discovered throughout Castle Čachtice provided forensic evidence that corroborated testimonial accounts, while documenting the scale of systematic murder that had been conducted within Elizabeth's territories. The careful concealment of human remains in walls, foundations, and specialized burial areas demonstrated systematic approaches to evidence disposal, while preserving materials that could support detailed analysis of causes of death, victim characteristics, and methods of violence that had been employed during research procedures. The investigation of Elizabeth's financial records revealed expenditures and resource allocation patterns that supported allegations of systematic murder while documenting investments in equipment, materials, and personnel that exceeded anything required for conventional aristocratic household operations. The accounting records that had been maintained for research-related expenses provided additional evidence of organizational capabilities while revealing the substantial costs associated with conducting systematic violence on the scale that testimonial and physical evidence had documented. But perhaps most significantly, Thurzo's investigation revealed that Elizabeth's criminal activities had continued right up until the moment of his arrival at Castle Čachtice, with evidence indicating that victims were being held and tortured at the time when royal officials began their examination of facilities and records. The discovery of subjects in various stages of conditioning and exploitation provided immediate proof that allegations of ongoing criminal activity were accurate, while demonstrating that Elizabeth had made no efforts to discontinue systematic murder, despite growing political pressure and increasing risks of discovery. The psychological assessment that emerged from Thurzo's investigation revealed personality characteristics and behavioral patterns that challenged conventional understanding of human nature, while providing insights into psychological factors that could enable someone of Elizabeth's intelligence and social position to conduct systematic murder without apparent moral conflict or emotional distress. The evidence collected through interviews with accomplices and examination of research records suggested psychological compartmentalization and moral detachment that exceeded anything previously documented in European criminal history. The political implications of Thurzo's findings extended far beyond Elizabeth's individual case to encompass fundamental questions about aristocratic privilege, royal authority, and legal accountability that would affect constitutional arrangements throughout the Habsburg domains. The evidence that had been collected documented criminal activities whose scale and systematic nature required response that would establish precedents for controlling noble behaviour while maintaining political relationships essential for governmental stability and military security. The comprehensive documentation that resulted from Thurzo's investigation provided King Matthias II with evidence sufficient to justify proceedings against Elizabeth, while supporting confiscation of properties whose value would address fiscal problems that had motivated royal interest in her case. But the political and legal complexities revealed through systematic examination of her activities would require careful management to prevent broader constitutional crisis that could threaten Habsburg authority throughout Central Europe. The investigators' arrival at Castle Čachtice had exposed criminal enterprise whose sophistication and scale exceeded anything previously documented in European history, while creating political and legal challenges that would test fundamental assumptions about justice, accountability, and governmental authority, in circumstances whose resolution would affect relationships between rulers and ruled for generations to come. The evidence that Thurzo had collected would either establish precedents for controlling aristocratic criminality or demonstrate the limitations of royal power when confronted with systematic violence conducted by subjects whose wealth and social position provided resources for resistance that exceeded conventional governmental capabilities. Chapter 13. The Trial of Servants. The judicial proceedings that commenced in January 1611 at the Castle of Bitche represented a masterpiece of legal engineering designed to satisfy multiple political objectives simultaneously while avoiding constitutional precedents that could threaten the fundamental privileges that protected aristocratic families from prosecution by royal authorities. The trial that emerged from György Thurzo's investigation would focus not on Elizabeth Báthory herself, whose noble status created insurmountable legal and political complications for formal prosecution, but on her accomplices whose lower social positions made them suitable subjects for judicial proceedings that could document systematic criminality while preserving aristocratic immunities that formed the foundation of Hungarian constitutional arrangements. The selection of defendants for formal prosecution reflected sophisticated understanding of both legal limitations and political necessities that governed royal authority in cases involving aristocratic criminality. Dorothea Sentes, János Ficsko, and Katarina Benica possessed neither the constitutional protections nor the political connections that could prevent their prosecution for activities that had been thoroughly documented through Thurzo's investigation, while their intimate involvement in Elizabeth's research operations made them capable of providing detailed testimony about systematic murder conducted on an unprecedented scale. But the exclusion of Elizabeth herself from formal judicial proceedings created complex legal and political problems that required careful management to prevent broader constitutional crisis, while satisfying public demands for justice and royal requirements for demonstrating effective authority over aristocratic subjects whose behaviour exceeded acceptable bounds. The solution that emerged through negotiations between royal officials and Hungarian noble leaders established precedents for managing aristocratic criminality through alternative mechanisms that could achieve practical objectives without challenging fundamental constitutional principles. The courtroom that was established at Bitche for conducting these proceedings represented innovations in judicial architecture designed to accommodate the extraordinary nature of evidence that would be presented while maintaining appropriate dignity for legal proceedings involving crimes whose scale and systematic nature exceeded anything previously encountered in European jurisprudence. The facilities that were constructed for managing witnesses, documentary evidence, and physical materials required specialized capabilities that could support comprehensive examination of criminal activities while preserving security and order throughout proceedings that would attract international attention and political scrutiny. The presiding judge, Theodosia Hercho de Herch, brought to these proceedings both extensive legal experience and sophisticated understanding of political complexities that would affect every aspect of judicial decision-making throughout trials that would establish precedents for managing aristocratic criminality while maintaining constitutional arrangements essential for political stability. His appointment reflected careful consideration of qualifications and political reliability that could ensure proceedings would serve royal objectives while preserving judicial credibility and legal legitimacy. The prosecution strategy that emerged through preliminary hearings focused on documenting systematic criminal enterprise through testimony from accomplices whose detailed knowledge of Elizabeth's research operations could provide comprehensive evidence of activities that exceeded legal definitions of acceptable behaviour while avoiding direct accusations against someone whose noble status created constitutional protections that could not be challenged without threatening fundamental political arrangements. The testimony provided by Dorothea Sentes during the first phase of proceedings revealed the full extent of systematic murder that had been conducted at Castle Čachtice, while documenting her own role in activities that demonstrated criminal culpability deserving severe punishment. Her detailed accounts of recruitment procedures, conditioning techniques, experimental protocols, and disposal methods provided evidence of organised violence whose sophistication exceeded anything previously documented in European criminal history, while establishing her intimate involvement in activities that clearly violated both civil and canonical law. But Dorothea's testimony also revealed the systematic psychological manipulation that had enabled Elizabeth to maintain loyalty and cooperation from accomplices whose continued participation in increasingly extreme activities had been secured through a combination of generous rewards, social elevation, and emotional dependencies that made resistance or betrayal psychologically difficult despite growing awareness of criminal nature of their activities. The techniques that had been employed for creating learned helplessness and institutional dependency demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology that had enabled systematic murder to continue for years without internal resistance or external revelation. The testimony of Janos Fičko provided detailed information about physical procedures and logistical arrangements that had enabled Elizabeth's research operations while documenting his own participation in systematic violence that exceeded anything justifiable through claims of following orders or aristocratic authority. His accounts of torture methods, blood collection procedures, and disposal techniques revealed technical knowledge and active participation that demonstrated criminal responsibility independent of whatever coercion or inducement Elizabeth might have employed to secure his cooperation. But Fičko's testimony also revealed the extent to which military training and social conditioning had prepared him for participation in systematic violence through psychological frameworks that placed enormous distance between aristocratic employers and common subjects whose welfare was considered irrelevant to achieving objectives that served superior interests. His apparent inability to recognize moral problems with activities that involved systematic murder of innocent subjects reflected broader social attitudes that facilitated aristocratic criminality through assumption of natural hierarchy that justified whatever methods proved necessary for maintaining noble privilege and authority. The testimony provided by Katerina Benica demonstrated the particular vulnerabilities that had made lesser nobility susceptible to recruitment for criminal activities, while revealing her own evolution from victim of economic and social pressures into active participant in systematic murder, whose sophistication exceeded anything attributable to mere following of instructions or submission to superior authority. Her detailed knowledge of recruitment procedures and psychological manipulation techniques indicated personal responsibility for activities that could not be dismissed as involuntary compliance with aristocratic demands. But Katerina's testimony also revealed the complex relationship between social position and criminal responsibility that characterized Elizabeth's recruitment and management of accomplices whose different backgrounds and capabilities had been systematically exploited to create organizational capabilities supporting systematic murder. Her case demonstrated how economic desperation and social vulnerability could be transformed into criminal complicity through sophisticated manipulation of human psychology and institutional dependency. The documentary evidence that was presented throughout these proceedings included detailed records of experimental procedures, subject characteristics, and research results that provided irrefutable proof of systematic murder conducted with scientific methodology and careful attention to optimizing outcomes through controlled experimentation. The meticulous record-keeping that had enabled Elizabeth to advance her research objectives also provided prosecutors with comprehensive documentation of criminal activities that could not be denied or minimized through conventional defense strategies. But the examination of documentary evidence also revealed the extent to which systematic murder had been justified through intellectual frameworks and theoretical constructs that transformed criminal violence into legitimate scientific research, serving purposes that transcended individual welfare in favor of knowledge that could benefit humanity. The philosophical and theoretical materials that had been preserved in Elizabeth's private papers demonstrated systematic thinking about human nature and aristocratic privilege that provided rational justification for activities that exceeded conventional moral limitations. The physical evidence that was examined during these proceedings included specialized equipment, architectural modifications, and preserved human remains that corroborated testimonial accounts, while demonstrating organizational capabilities and technical sophistication that confirmed allegations of systematic murder conducted on unprecedented scale. The forensic analysis of materials that had been collected from Castle Čachtice provided scientific documentation of criminal activities, while revealing methods and procedures that exceeded anything previously encountered in European legal contexts. The sentences that were imposed on Elizabeth's accomplices reflected both the severity of their crimes and political requirements for demonstrating effective royal authority, while establishing deterrent effects that could prevent similar activities by other aristocratic households whose behaviour might otherwise exceed acceptable bounds of noble privilege. Dorothea Sentes and Janos Fitzko were condemned to death by burning, punishments that emphasized the extraordinary nature of their crimes while providing public demonstration of judicial authority over systematic murder, regardless of aristocratic protection, that defendants might have expected to receive. Katerina Benica received life imprisonment rather than execution, a sentence that reflected both her lesser role in systematic murder and political considerations related to her noble background that created complications for applying capital punishment to someone whose social position provided constitutional protections that could not be entirely disregarded without establishing precedents that might threaten other members of the aristocratic class whose cooperation was essential for maintaining political stability. But perhaps most significantly, the trial proceedings established legal and political frameworks for managing aristocratic criminality that could achieve practical objectives of deterrence and punishment, while preserving constitutional principles that protected noble privileges from direct royal intervention. The precedents that were established through these proceedings would influence future approaches to controlling aristocratic behaviour while maintaining political arrangements essential for governmental effectiveness and social order throughout the Habsburg domains. The trial of servants had successfully documented systematic murder conducted on unprecedented scale, while avoiding direct confrontation with constitutional principles that protected aristocratic immunity from royal prosecution, creating legal and political solutions that satisfied multiple objectives without threatening fundamental arrangements that governed relationships between crown and nobility throughout Central European territories under Habsburg rule. Chapter 14. The Countess Judgment. The resolution of Elizabeth Báthory's case through house arrest rather than formal trial represented a masterpiece of political engineering that satisfied competing demands for justice, constitutional preservation, and practical governance while establishing precedents that would influence aristocratic behaviour and royal authority throughout the Habsburg domains for generations to come. The decision to confine Elizabeth within her own castle, rather than subjecting her to judicial proceedings that could have challenged fundamental constitutional principles, reflected sophisticated understanding of legal, political, and financial considerations that made alternative solutions preferable to direct confrontation between royal authority and aristocratic privilege. The negotiations that produced this extraordinary resolution involved complex calculations about constitutional law, political stability, and economic interests that extended far beyond Elizabeth's individual case to encompass broader questions about the relationship between noble immunity and criminal accountability in circumstances that challenged traditional frameworks for managing aristocratic misconduct. The participation of Hungarian noble leaders in designing Elizabeth's punishment demonstrated their recognition that systematic murder on the scale, documented through Thurzo's investigation, required response that could maintain public confidence in legal institutions while preserving aristocratic privileges essential for political stability. The legal framework that justified house arrest as appropriate punishment for Elizabeth's crimes relied on precedents that distinguished between aristocratic authority exercised within acceptable bounds and systematic criminality that exceeded constitutional protections traditionally afforded to noble families. The establishment of this distinction enabled royal officials to impose substantial restrictions on Elizabeth's liberty and authority while avoiding direct challenge to aristocratic immunity that could have created constitutional crisis affecting relationships between crown and nobility throughout Central Europe. But the practical implementation of Elizabeth's house arrest required architectural modifications and security arrangements that would ensure effective imprisonment while maintaining the dignity and comfort appropriate for someone of her social rank whose constitutional protections could not be entirely disregarded despite the severity of her crimes. The chambers within Castle Čachtice that were designated for her confinement were modified to prevent escape while providing living conditions that reflected her continued status as member of the highest nobility, whose punishment must be consistent with constitutional principles governing treatment of aristocratic subjects. The financial arrangements that accompanied Elizabeth's house arrest represented perhaps the most significant practical consequence of proceedings that had originated in royal interest in her substantial wealth and properties. The settlement that was negotiated between royal officials and Elizabeth's legal representatives resulted in massive confiscation of assets that addressed Habsburg fiscal problems while providing compensation for victims' families and funding for governmental operations that had been constrained by inadequate revenues from conventional sources. The transfer of Elizabeth's estates to royal control was accomplished through legal mechanisms that characterized the confiscation as payment of debts and fines rather than criminal punishment, preserving constitutional fiction that aristocratic property remained protected from arbitrary seizure, while enabling practical achievement of objectives that had motivated royal interest in her case from the beginning. The revenues that were generated through this process provided King Matthias X with financial resources that exceeded anything available through parliamentary taxation, while demonstrating royal capability to enforce legal authority over even the most powerful noble subjects. But the management of Elizabeth's punishment also required ongoing supervision and security arrangements that could ensure effective imprisonment while preventing the kind of martyrdom or popular sympathy that might have resulted from more dramatic forms of punishment such as public execution or spectacular judicial proceedings. The house arrest that was implemented at Castle Čachtice was designed to remove Elizabeth from public view, while maintaining conditions that would prevent her case from becoming rallying point for aristocratic resistance to royal authority. The isolation that characterized Elizabeth's imprisonment was achieved through systematic restriction of communication and contact that prevented her from maintaining relationships or influence that could threaten political arrangements that had been established through her case. The supervision that was implemented ensured that her confinement would continue until death provided final resolution of circumstances that had created unprecedented challenges for constitutional and political arrangements throughout the Habsburg territories. The psychological impact of house arrest on someone of Elizabeth's temperament and background represented perhaps the most severe punishment that could be imposed without violating constitutional protections that preserved aristocratic dignity and social position. The transformation from absolute authority over vast territories and thousands of subjects to complete dependence on guards and supervisors whose authority over her daily existence represented fundamental reversal of power relationships that had defined her identity and self-understanding throughout her adult life. The conditions of Elizabeth's imprisonment were carefully designed to prevent suicide or self-harm that could have deprived royal authorities of satisfaction that came from maintaining effective control over someone whose systematic criminality had challenged fundamental assumptions about aristocratic behaviour and constitutional arrangements. The monitoring that was implemented ensured that Elizabeth would experience full psychological consequences of her punishment, while remaining alive to serve as example of royal capability to enforce legal authority over aristocratic subjects whose behaviour exceeded acceptable bounds. But perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's house arrest enabled royal authorities to maintain control over information about her case, while preventing the kind of public testimony or dramatic revelations that might have resulted from formal trial proceedings. The secrecy that surrounded her imprisonment ensured that details about systematic murder would not become public knowledge that could inspire imitation or create political complications for governmental authorities whose effectiveness depended on maintaining public confidence in legal institutions and constitutional arrangements. The religious dimensions of Elizabeth's punishment reflected contemporary understanding of divine justice and spiritual accountability that required acknowledgement of sin and acceptance of penance as prerequisites for salvation despite constitutional protections that preserved social position and material comfort. The spiritual guidance that was provided during her imprisonment was designed to encourage confession and repentance, while maintaining security arrangements that prevented unauthorized communication or influence that could threaten political stability. The medical supervision that was implemented to monitor Elizabeth's health during imprisonment ensured that natural death would provide final resolution of her case, while preventing premature mortality that could have created complications for political and legal arrangements that had been established through her punishment. The healthcare that was provided reflected continued recognition of her aristocratic status, while serving practical objectives of maintaining effective imprisonment until circumstances permitted final closure of proceedings that had created unprecedented challenges for governmental authority. The administrative arrangements that governed Elizabeth's imprisonment required ongoing coordination between royal officials, local authorities, and security personnel whose responsibilities included maintaining effective confinement while preserving constitutional principles and political relationships that had been affected by her case. The bureaucratic mechanisms that were developed for managing these complex requirements established precedents that would influence future approaches to controlling aristocratic behaviour while maintaining political stability essential for effective governance. The duration of Elizabeth's house arrest, which continued until her death in August 1614, provided sufficient time for political and social circumstances to evolve in ways that reduced the immediate impact of her case, while enabling governmental authorities to consolidate control over her confiscated properties and establish permanent arrangements for managing revenues that had been generated through proceedings against her. The length of her imprisonment also ensured that public attention would shift to other concerns, while memories of systematic murder faded sufficiently to prevent ongoing political complications. The death of Elizabeth Báthory in confinement provided final resolution of legal and political challenges that had been created by systematic criminality whose scale exceeded anything previously encountered in European contexts. Her natural death eliminated remaining constitutional complications while ensuring that revenues and properties that had been confiscated would remain permanently under royal control, achieving practical objectives that had motivated governmental interest in her case, while establishing precedents that would influence aristocratic behaviour and royal authority throughout Central European territories under Habsburg rule. The Countess judgment that had been implemented through house arrest rather than formal prosecution represented successful resolution of unprecedented challenges to constitutional and political arrangements, while achieving practical objectives that served multiple governmental interests simultaneously. The precedents that were established through Elizabeth's case would influence future approaches to managing aristocratic criminality, while preserving fundamental principles that governed relationships between royal authority and noble privilege throughout the Habsburg domains for generations to come. Chapter 15. The Legend in Stone. The chamber where Elizabeth Báthory breathed her last breath on the night of August 21st, 1614, was illuminated only by a single candle that cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed the transformation of one of Europe's most powerful women into a forgotten prisoner whose death would mark the beginning of her metamorphosis from historical figure into legendary monster. She died alone, as she had lived for the final 4 years of her existence, separated from the world that had once trembled at her authority by stone barriers that had become both her protection and her tomb, preserving her life while destroying everything that had made that life worth living. The official records of Elizabeth's death were brief and deliberately uninformative, recording only that the Countess had expired from natural causes while confined to her chambers under royal authority, without mentioning the systematic murder that had justified her imprisonment, or the vast wealth that had been confiscated through proceedings that had eliminated one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in European history. The bureaucratic language that characterized these documents reflected governmental determination to minimize public attention to circumstances that had created unprecedented challenges for constitutional arrangements governing aristocratic privilege and royal authority throughout the Habsburg domains. But the silence that official sources maintained about Elizabeth's crimes and punishment could not prevent the emergence of popular narratives that transformed documented facts into folklore, historical events into mythological tales, and systematic murder into supernatural horror that captured public imagination while obscuring the political and economic factors that had actually motivated governmental action against someone whose wealth and power had made her vulnerable to royal intervention despite her aristocratic protections. The stories that began circulating throughout Central Europe within months of Elizabeth's death reflected popular fascination with aristocratic excess and criminal behaviour, while serving psychological needs for explanations that could make comprehensible activities whose systematic nature and unprecedented scale exceeded normal human understanding of cruelty and violence. The transformation of Elizabeth from political figure into legendary monster enabled communities throughout her former territories to process trauma associated with systematic murder while maintaining belief in fundamental human decency that might otherwise have been challenged by accurate knowledge of activities that had been conducted with scientific precision and unlimited resources. The vampire legends that would eventually make Elizabeth's name synonymous with supernatural evil emerged gradually through oral tradition that combined accurate information about blood-related activities with supernatural explanations that could account for systematic murder without acknowledging social and political factors that had enabled aristocratic criminality to continue for years without intervention by authorities whose primary interest lay in financial rather than humanitarian concerns. The folklore that developed around Elizabeth's memory served multiple functions within communities that had been affected by her activities, while providing frameworks for understanding systematic violence that could preserve social cohesion and moral certainty despite evidence of human capability for organized evil that challenged conventional assumptions about civilization and progress. The supernatural elements that were incorporated into popular narratives about her crimes enabled psychological distance from historical realities while maintaining cautionary messages about aristocratic power and its potential for abuse when exercised without moral constraint or external supervision. But the physical evidence of Elizabeth's systematic murder continued to accumulate long after her death, as construction projects and archaeological investigations revealed human remains throughout her former territories, creating ongoing discoveries that reinforced popular beliefs about her supernatural nature, while providing scientific documentation of criminal activities whose scale had been even greater than contemporary authorities had recognized during proceedings that had focused primarily on political and financial rather than humanitarian concerns. The castle that had served as both her residence and her laboratory was abandoned within years of her death, becoming a ruin whose deteriorating walls concealed evidence that would not be fully excavated and analysed until archaeological techniques developed sufficiently to support systematic investigation of medieval and early modern crime scenes. The architectural modifications that had been implemented to support Elizabeth's research operations remained hidden within the castle structure, preserving testimony about systematic murder while contributing to supernatural atmosphere that attracted tourists and scholars interested in understanding European history's darkest chapters. The legal precedents that had been established through Elizabeth's case continued to influence governmental approaches to managing aristocratic criminality throughout Central European territories under Habsburg rule, while the financial benefits that had been derived from confiscating her properties provided ongoing revenues that supported military and administrative operations for decades after her death. The practical achievements of proceedings against her demonstrated royal capability to enforce legal authority over aristocratic subjects whose behaviour exceeded acceptable bounds, while preserving constitutional arrangements essential for maintaining political stability and noble cooperation. But perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth's case established intellectual and cultural frameworks that would influence European understanding of systematic violence and criminal psychology for centuries to come, providing early evidence of human capability for organised evil that would later be recognised as characteristic of totalitarian regimes and genocide conducted with industrial efficiency and scientific methodology. The documentation that was preserved from her activities offered insights into psychological factors and organisational methods that enabled systematic murder while challenging assumptions about individual and institutional morality that had previously provided confidence in human nature and social progress. The scholarly research that was conducted into Elizabeth's life and crimes during subsequent centuries revealed the extent to which her case had been shaped by political and economic factors rather than supernatural influences, while demonstrating that systematic murder had been enabled by social arrangements and legal protections rather than individual pathology alone. The academic literature that emerged from these investigations provided comprehensive analysis of circumstances that had made unprecedented criminality possible, while offering lessons about preventing similar activities through institutional reforms and legal innovations. The feminist interpretations that developed during the 20th century offered alternative perspectives on Elizabeth's case that emphasized gender dynamics and social constraints affecting aristocratic women whose opportunities for autonomous action had been limited by patriarchal arrangements, while their access to power had created possibilities for rebellion against social expectations through activities that challenged conventional assumptions about feminine nature and capability. These analyses provided insights into relationships between gender, power, and violence, while questioning historical narratives that had focused primarily on supernatural explanations rather than social and political factors. But the archaeological discoveries that were made during renovations of Castle Čachtice in the early 21st century provided definitive physical evidence of systematic murder that confirmed historical accounts while revealing organizational sophistication and technical innovation that had enabled unprecedented criminal enterprise to operate for years without detection by authorities whose interests lay primarily in financial rather than humanitarian concerns. The forensic analysis of human remains that were discovered throughout the castle provided scientific documentation of torture methods and murder techniques that exceeded anything previously documented in European criminal history. Outro Dr. Sarah Kovacs stood in the restored Great Hall of Castle Čachtice on a grey November morning in 2019, surrounded by the tools of modern archaeology that had finally revealed the full extent of Elizabeth Báthory's systematic murder. The international team that she led had spent 3 years excavating evidence that confirmed the most horrifying allegations while demonstrating organizational capabilities that had enabled unprecedented criminality to continue for years without adequate governmental response. What we have discovered here challenges everything we thought we understood about medieval and early modern crime, Dr. Kovacs explained to the assembled journalists and scholars who had gathered to hear the preliminary results of investigations that had attracted worldwide attention. This was not random violence or individual pathology, but systematic murder conducted with scientific methodology and industrial efficiency that anticipates developments we associate with 20th century totalitarian regimes. The evidence that her team had documented included not only human remains that confirmed systematic torture and murder, but architectural modifications, specialized equipment, and organizational systems that demonstrated intellectual sophistication and administrative capability that had enabled Elizabeth to conduct research activities while maintaining political relationships and social reputation throughout her criminal career. The most disturbing aspect of what we have found, Dr. Kovacs continued, is not the scale of violence alone, but the systematic nature of activities that treated human subjects as experimental materials while maintaining elaborate deceptions that enabled criminal enterprise to operate within legitimate institutional frameworks. The exhibition that opened at Castle Čachtice following completion of archaeological investigations provided comprehensive documentation of Elizabeth's crimes while offering analysis of social, political, and psychological factors that had enabled systematic murder to continue for years without adequate intervention by authorities whose primary concerns lay in financial and political rather than humanitarian considerations. But perhaps most importantly, the castle had been transformed into an international centre for studying systematic violence and criminal psychology, where scholars from throughout the world could examine evidence of organised evil while developing understanding of institutional factors that enabled individual pathology to become systematic criminality, affecting hundreds of victims whose lives had been destroyed through activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social progress. The legend in stone that Elizabeth Báthory had become through centuries of folklore and popular culture had finally been replaced by scientific understanding of historical realities that were far more disturbing than supernatural explanations. but also more useful for preventing similar tragedies through legal reforms, institutional innovations, and social changes that could address underlying factors that had made unprecedented criminality possible. The walls of Castle Čachtice that had once concealed systematic murder now preserved evidence and analysis that could contribute to protecting future generations from organised violence conducted with scientific precision and unlimited resources by individuals whose social position and institutional protection enabled criminal activities to continue despite mounting evidence of systematic abuse and murder. Elizabeth Báthory's transformation from historical figure into cautionary tale was complete, but the lessons provided by her case would continue influencing understanding of human capability for organised evil while offering insights into preventing similar activities through institutional reforms that could address social, political, and legal factors that had enabled systematic criminality to flourish under cover of legitimate authority and constitutional protection. The blood that had once flowed through the chambers of Castle Čachtice had been replaced by knowledge that could serve humanitarian purposes, transforming systematic murder into educational opportunity that honoured victims while providing insights essential for protecting human dignity and individual rights against institutional arrangements that could otherwise enable systematic violence conducted with scientific methodology and unlimited resources by individuals whose power exceeded their moral development and social responsibility. The end for the 650 victims whose names were never recorded, for those who suffered in silence and died in darkness, for everyone who refuses to accept that power justifies cruelty. Remember Elizabeth Báthory not as legend, but as warning.